Hear me? Is this working? Okay, good. Before we start, how about everybody give me a big, loud good morning? Good morning. There you go. Now one more. Good morning. Good morning. I know you've had quite a night for some of you, if not many of you. And we're delighted, as we've been saying all week, to have you here, but more for now. I think you'll be amazed at yourselves at the end of this presentation. It's competitive, and we have judges who know how to judge, and let me introduce them. First is a lady who you've already met, Linda Brethid, but just to remind you, as a judge, she has been a public service commissioner, and she has been on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, so she knows how to look at a presentation. Brad Cowgill is another judge. He is an attorney, but he has also been the state budget director. He's been the chairman of the Kentucky Council of Higher Education. He's been an adjunct professor here at UK, at Gatton. And he is on the advisory board of the Martin School and is one of the real conduits between the Henry Clay Center and the Martin School. So thank you, Brad, and Brenda. Richard Daugherty is an attorney. And what he is, I would say, one of the great citizen soldier politicians with the way he writes op-eds. And he teaches us all that we all have a voice. Maybe he'll write an op-ed about us, we hope. But his commentary, as a citizen, non-combatant, I'll call you, is admirable by both sides. So I pass that on, that your roles, and everybody keeps trying to tell us it's about you, although last night it's not all about you, but we need you in the fray. And this is a good example of how you continually to do it. And lastly, we're very lucky to get Jim Gray. Jim Gray is a Vanderbilt graduate, went to work in his family's worldwide construction business, but left that for the public sector and has been the two-term mayor of Lexington. And he now is the Secretary of Transportation for the Commonwealth. He's appointed by Governor Andy Beshear, who once again says his regrets that he couldn't meet with you, but as we've been telling you, if you put on the news here every night, you see where he is. So really, you have a pretty rigorous group of judges, and that will make you feel even better when you hear their questions and finally when you see how they thought about what you said. So with that, I'll introduce Merle, who will tell you how many rounds this will go, et cetera. But thank you. Your culmination of your week of hard work here is about to be fulfilled, and I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you.
As Bill suggested, we may go into several rounds if we have a tie, so just be prepared. And we have to represent and so forth, just like they do in Congress, and they go on until we have a deadline at midnight tonight to finish this process. So just relax. It's not going to take that long. Maybe just a few observations and ground rules, if you will. Each team will have 20 minutes, approximately 15 minutes for presentation, and then we'll allow 5 minutes for questions from our illustrious panel. In terms of the order, there was a drawing earlier this morning. Presentation order will be immigration first, international health and environmental standards and compliance second, tariff and trade third, and defense alliances will have the fourth position. We'll have a slight break between each team. We've asked each team to have a chair or moderator to introduce the team first, and then also to guide the presentation. We'll have a break after two presentations. We have late arrival coffee for a variety of reasons, which we don't understand, but they're just part of the process. So we'll have, after two presentations, we'll have a slight break, and we'll continue and have the last two presentations. Other than that, the judges have been provided with information. They have scoring forms, and they also have your memos, which actually I got the last one at 2:30 this morning. I stayed up all night waiting for it, several cups of coffee, hoping it would arrive, and finally got there. So I was able to print those off and bring those to the judges this morning. So thank you all for being here, and particularly appreciate the efforts of our judges for being here this morning. Again, we apologize for no cups for coffee, but you know, there's always little things in life that you just cannot control. So It's out there? Oh, great, okay. So with that, the first team, yes, you're on board. You're on the clock, as they say on the, so, okay. Who's your moderator? Have them introduce the whole team first, right? Right, okay.
Should we, well, we have a slide that has like, sorry, my voice is loud.
You may want to load it.
Yeah, oh, is it on? I don't have a log.
A login?
Yes. Wait,
Danielle, I think you're after me, so I'm gonna go in front of you.
oh, there, okay, he's here.
Okay, okay. As long as
Do you know how you're introducing us?
I was just gonna say this is Group A, Group B.
and then we can just wave, I think.
Yeah, it's Group A,
Do they want fuller introductions?
Do you want our names?
Wait, actually, we also do have a bigger. We could also like have up the side. That seems great. Thank you so much.
Okay,
I can pull it up.
okay, I was like, I do not know how to get there.
I just didn't know we were. I thought we were just saying this.
Yeah, am I gonna be clicking through
Yeah.
her? Yeah, she's just logged in, so she can pull it up.
Abby just to log in because Abby has all the presentations lined up. So it might be easier for Abby to log in so no one else. Because I only have my presentation, so she's back there. Do you want me to go grab her?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, you know what? Everyone's here.
What?
Everyone's here, so.
It's a good start.
Exactly. I don't know if I like the mic. Hey guys.
I was gonna say it's definitely on.
That's hot.
Oh, we like. Can we move this up and then once you're done speaking, you just kind of, walk back? Oh, yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Okay, ideas.
I was thinking you have
So is it like projecting on here, or is it coming? Oh no, that's not.
Turn down.
Yeah, I don't know how to do this.
Are we gonna pull down the screens too? I think it's just default settings.
I'm nervous,
Good
but
morning,
then
everyone.
Good morning. Thank you, fellow
Issue
fellow
that we
college
identified.
student representatives, esteemed judges. Do I say esteemed judges? Yes. Oh wait, it has it over there too, bro. This is so bougie. But like that's so nice because you can.
But thank you.
Yeah, that's. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for.
Yeah, I don't really want this. I feel like maybe like. Like.
No, use that.
Yeah, I wish. I don't want to preserve that, especially with y'all know I'm trying to preserve it, but I'll be loud. They'll be like, goddamn, she's a brand smooth girl.
Be like however you want. Especially you judges.
Oh, do I say esteemed judges?
Esteemed judges.
Glaze them a little, you
Yeah,
know.
we have to
Lube them up.
we have to glaze them.
Guys, trust. Should be, process should be.
our presentation is linked there.
You got default?
Yes.
Yes. So Olivia, you'll be in charge of changing slides. Whenever you say slide, you change it. Got it. Thank you. Just like right next to you.
It doesn't seem like it.
Oh no. Oh wait, you can see the next one. I don't know if I. Oh no, that's the end. I can just hover it. There. You got it?
What if we put it on this side? Can you drag it to here?
Wait, why would that matter?
So, because it's like, I feel like this is more serious.
Can you like mirror duplicate it?
Let's go.
It loads.
Let's go.
Oh.
Oh.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Abby.
Thanks, Abby.
Thanks, guys. I'm gonna kill it. Okay, we ready?
Yes.
I'll wait till they all sit.
Be quick. We got this.
Okay. Hey y'all, we're the immigration group. Welcome to our presentation. We're so excited to start off this awesome policy compromise. Thank you judges for being here. Thank you all, everyone else that's here. Y'all, those of y'all that are streaming in. We're gonna start with a little introduction. Here is our team A that represents the more progressive side of the immigration policy. We come from all over. And then we also have team B, which also comes from all over the United States. It was really cool getting to know people from all across America and hearing each other's perspectives, and we can't wait to share with you guys. A little bit of a roadmap. We're gonna start with showing y'all a little background on the issue, just so y'all know where we are coming from. Next, we're gonna go into our initial Team A and Team B policy proposals, and then we're gonna show y'all our compromise, which is our favorite part, and then end with questions.
Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Nama, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our problem statement and the background for immigration. Slide, please. So as you all probably know, immigration is a very large issue. So we had to really condense what our problem statement was encapsulating, and we ended up deciding that U.S. immigration has faced a very big challenge in the past decade, and that has been expansion and restriction policies in specific. Right now, the U.S. is facing a very large labor shortage, and we need to address the intense and just influx of DACA recipients that do not have a legal pathway to citizenship. So that is what we're addressing today through tying in economic needs and national security. And then just to touch on immigration, there's a long, deep history to it, but we wanted to highlight some of the important facts. And to begin with, in the 1990s, there was about 1 million immigrants immigrating to the United States per year. This was due to the Immigration Act of 1990. And then in the 2000s, George W. Bush integrated a lot of border security and visa regulations through the Patriot Act and the Secure Fence Act. And then since then, our administrations, the Obama administration, the Biden administration, and the Trump administration currently are dealing with immigration influx, and it's continuing to rise, but the way that they're addressing it has all differed. In Obama's administration, we saw DACA. In the Biden administration, we saw a lot of backlash because many people had said that Biden had not dealt with immigration in a secure and efficient manner. And then now we're seeing Trump administration deal with the influx of immigration through a lot of executive orders. So hopefully our compromise will address all of these, but thank you.
So I'm Daniel, I'm from the more progressive group, and I just kind of wanted to go over what our initial proposal to the other side looked like to address this issue. So our proposal can kind of be summarized in three main goals. First is to increase immigrant workers to the United States to fill critical gaps in our labor force. Second, we wanted to decrease the wait times for green cards and visas approval, which currently can take years for companies to sponsor and immigrants to enter the United States. And finally, we wanted to reduce uncertainty for migrants who want to cross at the border legally, as well as migrants who are currently in the United States who are unclear on their status. So we had 5 proposed solutions for this. First, we wanted to double permanent worker green cards available to people who want to migrate to the United States and work there permanently, as well as temporary H-2B visas for workers who are unskilled and want to fill those critical labor gaps on a temporary basis. Second, we wanted to reform USCIS visa allotment to ensure that these worker visas are going to workers and that they are able to enter the United States in areas, specifically in sectors that are currently in need of filling in a labor gap. We also wanted to increase USCIS staffing capacity to make sure that these things are processed expeditiously and that employers are able to accurately and easily secure migrant workforces to fill these gaps. To reduce uncertainty, we also sought to hire 100 new immigration judges to process the backlog of 3.6 million immigration cases that are currently in the United States, which give migrants and people living in the United States uncertainty about their status, which is incredibly dangerous for them, as well as reinstate the Safe Mobility Office program, which would, for migrants who are trying to cross at the border, give them an idea beforehand, before making this perilous journey that often results in death or injury, give them an idea of what their status is so that they can decide whether or not to make that journey without doing it in the first place.
Hello, everybody. My name is Axel, and I'll be talking a little bit about Teams B's proposal. Slide, please. So we had 4 guiding principles when we were thinking about this, and they all entrenched us into the conservative viewpoint on immigration. One, we wanted strategic control. We wanted to regain control of the U.S.-Mexico border and have that under control before we proceeded with anything else. We also wanted to take fairness and accountability into account. We thought that a visa lottery system was not fair and that U.S. citizenship should be earned rather than be luck-based. And we also wanted to address DACA, which was a program that was implemented through executive order and issued through the DHS memorandum. We thought that DACA had failed the recipients of it, over 580,000, and we also wanted to have those workers who were contributing members of American society finally have a pathway to citizenship. Finally, we wanted to do security to innovation. We wanted to use AI and different programs to be able to secure our border, but also know who is inside our country. Next slide, please. So we had 4 key policy shifts. Number 1 was the elimination of the diversity visa lottery. Like I mentioned, there was about 55,000 lotteries allowed through the system, but we thought that at first it was a great program that helped increase diversity into the United States from countries that had less immigrant populations. But we thought at this point it was outdated and we needed a merit-based system. That's where a merit pathway came. We were going to judge them on different criteria, whether it be education, a job placement, age, and what they can contribute to the United States. We also were going to terminate the DACA program, which is Deferred Actions for Childhood Arrivals. While the program was great at first, it was never meant to be a long-term solution. And we thought that the best way to do this was to terminate it, give a 1-year window where DACA recipients could apply for an expedited green card process, and that would be that. We would not accept any further applications because at this point, this is not going to be an issue where we keep on giving status to undocumented youth. At this point, we draw the line. We also wanted to create the American Values and Immigration Act. This act saw the use of AI harnessing in immigration, specifically at the southern border, like countries like Canada and Australia do. We also wanted to use this act to, again, increase the path, which would increase the work visas for immigrants that were able to contribute to the American economy. And last was the creation of the American Always Act. This act also saw the termination of DACA and would, again, create that pathway expedited for 1 year for DACA recipients to receive a pathway to citizenship.
Hello, my name is Ms. Sumit, and we are now going to transition to the most exciting part of the presentation, the compromise. We've seen 2 different perspectives, a lot of different solutions proposed, but we're going to see in the next couple of slides what we generally have found to be our compromise. First, we're going to see that we're going to replace DACA and diversity visas with a more strategic, merit-based scorecard. Secondly, we're going to streamline the immigration process by pausing green cards. And then finally, we're going to fill jobs and really bolster the American economy.
But I bet you're wondering how we got there. So on Tuesday, we began researching and brainstorming potential policy solutions and recommendations in our individual assigned groups. And then on Wednesday, we met with both groups to discuss and shrink our scope and make sure we were on the right path. Next slide. And then on Thursday, we went back to our separate groups to solidify what we decided
we wanted our individual proposals to be. And then we met together again and we read our proposals and we made initial notes. And then on the final day, we discussed our proposals and started asking questions. And then we split into little mini caucuses or groups and came up with a compromise in each aspect of our policy area.
Hey y'all, so I'll be introducing Group A's, one of our main policy proposals. It was called the Heartland Visa. The Heartland program was meant to emphasize state and employer partnerships while also bringing them into the fray on immigration. So how this would work was states would identify local labor shortages and states would unite with corporations to fill jobs. Local employers would send states their labor requests and offer job placements to legal immigrants trying to find citizenship, but ultimately the Heartland was a temporary visa that later offered a path to full citizenship. Our goal was to ultimately empower underpopulated and rural economies so that immigrants were not settling only in cities, but also spreading all across our nation and helping integrate them into the community, as well as emphasize American values.
Hi, I'll be talking about Group B's proposal, and so we decided to replace the diversity visa lottery system with a merit-based system called Merit Path. So we developed a two-tiered system assessing economic and educational factors to ensure for a structured approach. This framework prioritizes stability and self-dependence, reducing the reliance on public assistance programs while fostering long-term success for newcomers. Slide. Sorry.
So as we can see here, there's a map, and this kind of tracks us through the worker shortage index across the country. You can tell North and South Dakota have less people than jobs, so the distribution of jobs and people is a little bit skewed here. But we realized pretty quickly that combining Merit Path and Heartland might be a good idea. So together we negotiated how many tiers there should be, if it should only be economic and educational. We figured out bonus point factors such as entrepreneurial prowess, do you have the potential to make a new business while you're here, or things like regional resettlement. Ultimately, our goal was to bring more state agency into the process and figure out how we can do point allocations to ensure that immigrants are able to spread all across our country in a safe manner that boosts our economy.
The regional resettlement framework, it ensures that we take in the factors of consideration of economic and educational tiers to assess and make sure that immigrants are applicable to and qualified to coming. So you can grab 2 points. Applicants can grab 2 points if they are committed to resettling in an underserved area. And then applicants can also grab 3 points if they have previously studied at a U.S. institution. Hi, so these are the scorecards for our framework. And so basically it'll work like this. So say for example that I have a law degree from another country and I've been practicing for 10 years. And say that rural Kansas has an identified lawyer shortage that I am committed to alleviating. As an applicant, I would meet or exceed the economic tier as I would fulfill the categories underneath it.
Having checked off employment, long previous work experience, and clicked the box for regional pledge, we would then move into the educational tier. Obviously, if you're a lawyer, you're going to have higher education, so you'll amass points for a bachelor's, master's, or doctoral degree. However, under regional expertise, let's say that instead of attending a university in a different country, you attend a university at Kansas State. Since you attended university at Kansas State, you've already been familiar with the area, you already understand American values and are able to embed within that context. So you'll earn up to an additional 3 points along with considering your English proficiency strength. And that's sort of how our scorecard system works and is weighted.
Hey everyone, I'm Satyam, and I'll be talking about the next area of our compromise, which was on DACA, visa, and green cards. So the first thing we all agreed on was that DACA should be terminated as a program. So putting some dates in, on June 1st, 2025, DACA would be terminated. However, we don't plan on leaving DACA recipients hanging or removing them from the country as they contribute billions of dollars to our economy. So from June 1st, 2025 to June 1st, 2026, DACA recipients can apply for green cards. Now, due to the sudden influx of about 500,000 applications to green cards, we plan on pausing non-DACA green card applications for a year after to review those DACA applicants. And overall, this contributes to our end goal of providing DACA recipients with a pathway to citizenship. However, one caveat we want to say is refugee applications in the green card process will be suspended. However, they'll be given temporary protected status, and then once all applications resume, they'll be given priority.
Hi everyone, my name is Xander, and you may be wondering, as we pause non-DACA green card applicants, how are we going to fill critical labor shortages in our economy if we're not awarding the same amount of green cards that we have been awarding previously? So first, I just want to address that the reason we're doing that is to address a backlog in our system. Right now, it takes several years beyond the stated goal of how long it's supposed to take to review DACA applicants. But a compromise that we came to was regarding visas. So we would temporarily double work green cards to 300,000 in a 2-year period between 2027 and 2029 after we've reviewed all the green card applications and awarded them to DACA recipients. We would permanently revert to 175,000 work green cards, which is an increase of 25,000 green cards awarded each year after that 300,000 period in 2029. We would also increase H-2B visas to 90,000 from 66,000, which would increase some of the labor shortages in critical areas in our economy, such as construction, landscaping, hospitality, among other areas. And we would also increase filing fees for USCIS for those applying for a green card. And just to be clear, this is not on the burden of the individual, but rather on the burden of corporations because they exclusively fund those fees.
Hi, I'm Maddie, and I'll be discussing the more humanitarian aspect. So regarding current refugee populations, they are admitted through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. This involves either referral by the UNHCR or they are required referral by a U.S. embassy. This would involve an intensive process with security, clearance screening, as well as interviews, and then after that, they may be granted temporary resettlement within the U.S. After that year of resettlement, they can decide to apply for a green card, and then after that, they are eligible for citizenship 4 years later.
Hi, my name is Oishiki. I wanted to, could we go back one second? Yeah, sorry. I wanted to touch more on the compromise and our policy proposal itself. So one of the compromise and shared values between policy group A and policy group B is the idea of resettlement and tighter border security. The Liberals, or policy group A, had a proposal that wanted to increase visa allotments, increase humanitarian aid, and ease the process of applications itself. The Policy Group B wanted to stick to the status quo in the INA and the executive branch and also work on tighter border security. What we decided on was reinstating the safe mobility offices. These are offices all over Latin America, especially Central and South America, which are offices run by the DHS and USCIS. Refugees that are making the journey up can stop at these offices before they make the perilous journey all the way up to the US-Mexico border, and they can see whether or not they even qualify for asylum or refugee protections under US standards. If they don't, we're going to try and work with partner countries in that area to resettle them under other countries' definitions of refugee and asylum. This idea has met the international standards of non-refoulement and also worked on responsibility sharing of the migration crisis.
In order to accomplish this goal of coming to this compromise, we actually formed a humanitarian reform caucus, and it was bipartisan with both groups. And we established that we wanted to solely keep this idea of the safe mobility offices. And then since the conservative group was okay with the status quo, we decided that the safe mobility offices were the best course of action for ensuring humanitarian protections were protected.
Hi, I'm Gwen. I was also in the conservative group. We talked a little bit earlier about how this policy tends to be too domestically focused during the status quo, and one of the goals of our policy was to make it more international. So that's part of the things that we compromised on, and I feel like we did a pretty good job. I don't know what you guys think, but yeah.
Sorry, well, thank you guys so much for listening to our presentation. Special thanks to our mentor, Dex. We felt he needs to be above us. But yeah. We would love to hear your guys' questions. This was a really exciting project for, I think, every one of us. We all came from different backgrounds, different experiences, and I think we came up with a pretty amazing compromise in only a few short days.
Is the mic on? Yep. Okay. I learned a lot. You did a lot of hard work. Thank you. I don't know if you had time to consider, but one of my questions was there's a lot of process in the recommendations. And if you had time to consider, do you think that the process would need more judges, more enforcement, more personnel on the other end of your policy recommendations? You might not have had time to even factor that in.
What do you mean by on the other end of our policy
Well,
recommendations?
you're the one end. You're
Yeah.
making the policy recommendations. The other end is how it happens. And the process and the need possibly for extra judges, extra enforcement. What? Implementation. Yeah, the implementation.
Yeah, so I think that was something that we pretty seriously considered throughout the process. First of all, we talked about increasing USCIS staff, so we're able to process these more efficiently. And some of that is going to be funded through the elimination of DACA and the reallocation of resources there. Some of it's going to be funded through the increase in fees for filing these on behalf of corporations. And additionally, we talked about hiring more U.S. immigration judges. And something interesting that we found is that the costs of hiring more immigration judges are actually offset by our ability to get migrants out of U.S. detainment because we're currently spending millions of dollars detaining these migrants in limbo when we could be spending that money on U.S. immigration judges who can address that 3.6 million case backlog and ultimately contribute to a more efficient immigration system.
Hello. Did you consider the current and past recent amount of visa slots from Mexico? How many slots were open for instance, Mexicans to come into America legally? Because that's been the real argument. Let them come in legally. Did you consider that?
I'm happy to take that one as well. We didn't look at the specific allocation from particular countries. What we wanted to do, I think, is focus on a more merit-based system and filling the specific needs of U.S. companies, U.S. labor shortages. So the idea that we kind of came up with is it doesn't really matter what country you're from, where these visas are allocated to. What we need are workers to come into the United States, contribute to these critical sectors, and ultimately benefit the U.S. economy.
It might surprise you that the number's zero.
Oh, really?
It was in the past. Now, another question I have. You had a point system for the educated elite, I'll call them attorneys, and that was good, but I would say that maybe 0.0% of those crashing our border are in that category. Was there a similar point system for the people really wanting to come, the poor, the disheveled, the downtrodden, who look for opportunities and want to work?
Yeah, so we did consider a lot of different factors going into educational and economic. Our idea was sort of that even if you didn't have some of the things in the educational tier, you'll notice it was weighed a little bit less. I think it was a 60-40 split. You might still have other relevant work experience or employment experience that will allow you to boost your points up. So for example, if you had maybe 30 years of work experience as an agricultural worker, you have a current job offer in the United States, and you are committed to particularly serving, you click the regional expertise box, you'd be able to basically amass so many points in the economic sector. Maybe you demonstrate entrepreneurial interest, maybe you had a company back in your country, that it might offset some of the educational factors that are not available.
30 years? Most of these immigrants coming are very young.
any amount of work experience.
Okay. Okay, thank you. No, thank you.
Okay, mine, y'all have done a great job on the presentation. And so I'm going to accept all the facts that were presented. And that's the hard side of stuff, the hard stuff. I'm going to ask a question about the soft side of things. And I'd like one person from each group to respond, because we haven't got all kinds of time. So one of y'all from each group respond to this question, if you would. What was most striking in the compromise, and what allowed you to change your mind or move over to an understanding, a willingness to understand the other side?
So I'm from Group B, which is the conservative side, and one thing that we found most striking is that we proposed the merit-based system to replace the diversity visa lottery program. And we were able to come to agreement that merit is important, that we need to fill critical job shortages in the economy, not necessarily that you need an education, but that you do fill one of those areas. And so proposing this merit-based solution, it was striking to see how amenable the other side was to the merit-based program. And we kind of started from there. That was our common ground, understanding that we want a merit-based system. And once we started with that diversity visa lottery program and replacing it with a merit-based system, that's where we began discussions on how much visa allotments we want to afford, which we came to great compromise to, and also replacing DACA.
Yeah, so I was on Team A, which is the more liberal group, and echoing a lot of what Xander said, I think that one of the things that was really striking for us is just how long it's been since there's been substantial change in the immigration system. I think everybody across the aisle really agrees that there's something broken with it, and that there needs to be these changes in efficiency, changes in allocation, changes in the way that we do things. And we were really able to come together to make a proposal on that, which was not something that I was expecting. Was that we really agreed on some of the areas that it was broken in. Even if there are these sort of issues at the periphery that really cause a lot of tension, we were able to come to a great compromise on some of the core principles that we agree upon.
Also, I'd like to address the question, back to the question that was presented earlier. And one of the ways that we try to structure our tier system is so that education isn't necessarily required, and that's one of the reasons that we increased the H-2B visas from 66,000 to 90,000 permanently, because we understand that an education is not necessary in some of these areas, such as landscaping, hospitality, construction, which are areas that are, there are critical shortages there. So an education is not necessarily important, and we wanted to make sure that we weighed the economic factors more, because that's incredibly pivotal to ensuring that we fill the gaps.
I think we have time for one more question for the panel. That would be me. I struggled to come up with a question. I guess I first wanted to make some observations. I thought you did an extraordinary job. I was truly impressed. The presentation was very well organized. Each of you made an articulate presentation. And in response to Jimmy's question, it looked to me as if there was a broader middle ground here than may have met the eye. And it seemed to me as if the breadth of that middle ground arose from the apparent focus of nearly all of you on economics. It seems to me that that's where all of this ultimately is resolved. I was very impressed by that sort of analysis, because it seems to me that the correct, well, first of all, I draw a thick black line that separates illegal immigration from legal immigration. And to your credit, you were focused on legal immigration, and you saw it in economic terms. And through an economic lens, what you saw was that what we're after is a matching of a talent pool internationally and a domestic demand. The better we can do that, the better all of us here in America. This is the one area in which it seems to me that America First actually is a pretty good idea. I was particularly impressed, if I may say so, by the scorecard. Of course, when you give high points for lawyers, you know, that naturally appealed. But I thought to get down to the point where whether you would actually use your scorecard or the whole idea of that scorecard, I thought really rang true. It was very well done. I would go so far as to say that I hope this has all been recorded because, in my opinion, your presentation was so good that it has value outside the particular program in which you guys are operating. I would look forward to reviewing this again myself so that I can digest what you've done. Now, is there a question? Mr. Caldwell, yes. It's this question. I'm only interested in sort of your perspective. When we talk about the matching of needs, we see within our country, and especially in the place where I live in Florida, a need for a lot of relatively low-skilled people to fill hospitality jobs, construction, landscaping, and so forth. And when we think about that, my own inclination, I am, by the way, trained in economics, is to think that over a long enough period of time, that problem, that shortage, solves itself through adjustments within the domestic economy without having to solve them through immigration. So this becomes sort of a question of whether your focus is on short-term or long-term. Short-term, there's no substitute, but for having enough labor. Long-term, you kind of think this solves itself. So I'm sort of interested in what your all's perspective was on how, you know, whether we really need to be bringing in a lot of low-skilled people to address what is a genuine but perhaps short-term need.
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two things that we looked at for that. First of all, what we saw is that in the United States, there's actually a declining birth rate and declining workforce participation. So what this is going to cause is it's going to cause people who are going to, there's going to be less taxes collected, there's going to be less people participating in the US economy as time goes on as a percentage. Right now it sits at about 62% workforce participation, and it's only getting lower year after year. So our idea was that this would pose a long-term solution to that, bring younger people into the country to sort of revitalize the economy and support some of the social systems, social safety nets that our aging American population is going to be relying on in the years to come, especially with advances in medicine, makes people live longer, things like that. The other thing that I think we want to mention in response to that is while this is a kind of short-term focus of the policy, it can be changed in later years if there are this shifts in demand that the US labor market corrects for. But right now we see these issues emerging, and we wanted to make sure that there was a policy in place now to address that, even if it does need to be modified or changed in the future.
I think our time is up, so let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.
Recent. Everybody grand? All right, ready? Got your spot? All right, do you want to tuck that over to the right? Do you want to tuck that over? Yeah, sure, sure, good. Ready?
All right. Good morning. Welcome to our panelists, fellow delegates, and those watching at home. My name is Lexi Duffy, and I'll be guiding you through the presentation from the International Health and Environmental Standards Committee. For our structure today, we've got 3 categories for you. We'll be starting with our initial proposals, going through rationales, and providing you with our policy recommendations, shifting into our compromise, and finally ending with a question and answer session. But before we get into the substance, we'd like you to know a little bit about who is presenting for you today. So today we have Team A. We have Ashley Riley, Andy Zhang, Emma Straczynski, Ethan Hepworth, Michelle Zhang, Emma Monroe, and myself, Lexi Duffy. On Team B, we have Fernando Ramos, Lauren Mesquita, Margareta Liu, Emma Marie Rivera Magdalene, Andrew Murray, and Edward Hunter. But starting with Team A. Team A was tasked with the pro-global side of international cooperation. So what this looked like is this group started with the factual basis that countries should be sharing risks, sharing accountability, and sharing resources when tackling issues that are related to international health and climate crises.
Thank you for that, Lexi. Hi, I'm Emma from Louisiana, and I'm going to be talking about Team A's stance. So ultimately, climate change is obviously increasing, and it's really affecting global health. Recent studies show that between 2030 and 2050, 250,000 deaths alone will be due to heat and global warming. We believe that global standards prevent free riding, and this is a framework that holds countries accountable and encourages collaboration. We believe that collaboration boosts efficiency and is ultimately crucial to encouraging cross-border collaboration, efforts, and shared resources. Justice is absolutely crucial in order to fight climate change, global health, and the warming of the earth. Our proposal is a framework based on a cap-and-trade system as an overreaching umbrella. The cap-and-trade system will place taxation on countries' overall emissions. This will be enforced by organizations that will be in charge of penalties and funding. Countries will reap benefits like data sharing and ultimately encourage them to want to join in order to stick to a proposed timeline.
Just to provide an overview of what a cap-and-trade system is, we place a cap on the amount of emissions that each country is allotted based off of different factors such as their specific context or the amount of people living in the country. And that a cap, the total amount of emissions allotted to each country will be ratcheted down over time to drive them toward carbon neutrality. We have recognized that these caps are somewhat arbitrary, so each country is allowed to trade within the market, which will provide the opportunity for high-emitting countries that exceed their limits to buy additional emission allotments from lower-emitting countries, creating a market for carbon emissions measured in metric tons. And this creates a market mechanism through which we're monetizing incentives to drive down carbon emissions, and it creates an international framework for countries to cooperate in this new carbon market. We based our model off of the European Union's emissions trading system, which has been in operation now for 2 decades. It has successfully reduced emissions in the targeted industries that the European Union has specified, and we hope that this new and larger market will lead to similar results.
I will talk a little bit more about other additions to our plan to further drive down emissions. So one of our proposals is to tax the emissions that's being produced, both the allotted amount, so the cap that we set for them based on their per capita population, but as well as additional tax on the traded amount to further disincentivize them to go over their allotted amount. We based our numbers on a 2017 study that found that a $49 tax on every metric ton of carbon dioxide produced will result in over $2.2 trillion in revenue
over the course of 10 years. We hope to put the funds into a fund that is managed by the UNFCCC, and then countries could apply to this fund to fund climate and health initiatives in their country.
One of the main carrots that we hope to use to incentivize countries to participate in this program is this new data sharing program. This is going to be an expansion of the early warning system that the United Nations rolled out just a few years ago in 2022. It provides information on weather, climate risks, and we hope to incorporate the GLUE system and also expand that. As it stands right now, it just provides information on animal carried disease that are hopping to humans, but we also hope to begin tracking human-to-human transmission and really share information better across the global community to prepare us for the many challenges that will be coming our way, both in health and in climate. So this system will be a great incentive for countries to join and tap into this network of expertise to ensure that we're prepared for the challenges coming our way.
We understand that there are a lot of disadvantages to international cooperation, so we came up with some oversight mechanisms to increase the efficiency of international cooperation. Our first caveat is penalties for countries that exceed their emissions caps. So this will result in countries having to submit a correction plan within 3 months in order to fix their emissions overproduction. Their emissions allowance for the next year will also be decreased by 8%, and they will be unable to purchase additional emissions from other countries. This prevents wealthier countries from continuously going over their emissions cap and just buying it from other countries because they're able to afford to do so. Our second way of providing oversight is through our funding mechanism. This is inspired by the IMF lending process. So first, countries who hope to add initiatives to their country's plan, they submit a request for funding. Then the organization, which we identify as the UNFCCC, will work with each country to come up with a policy plan that addresses their needs and how they could best move forward. Once funding is approved, the funding will be dispersed intermittently by the organization to ensure that there's no misuse of funds and that they are following their policy plan throughout the entire timeline that we set. And throughout this whole process, the organization will continue to provide oversight to ensure, again, no mismanagement of funds and that projects are proceeding on time.
So this timeline represents key milestones in order to achieve net zero emissions by the year 2050. It'll start with negotiations in the fall of 2025, followed by ratifications in 2027. Countries will sign on in the spring of 2028, and by the fall of 2028, there will be proposals. This will ultimately, our goal is to receive 50% reduction in emissions by the year 2034, starting with that. So a clear path forward.
And that concludes Group A's presentation, clearly a busy group for the week. But it brings us to Team B, which was assigned with the more isolationist stance in regard to health and climate crises, specifically such as with the Trump administration, currently leaving the WHO and the Paris Agreement. This group is really going to highlight for you the risks and the vulnerability that can come with over-reliance, as well as some of the accountability issues.
Yes. So some of our criticisms is that global collaboration kind of undermines national sovereignty. International institutions can sometimes overreach into these national sovereignties because they feel like they can, take in their Western civilization ideals and make it into like these smaller developing countries' norms and cultural traditions. International agreements have been politicized over the years. They are slow to act, maybe not the greatest in effectiveness as well, and they just basically have failed. Power imbalances have really led to over-reliant developing countries as well. Developing countries have to, these developed countries are giving them funds and things like that, and these developing countries have to constantly rely on them. So whenever these developed countries are going away with their policies and frameworks, these developing countries kind of leave off and they don't know what to do. So we don't want that over-reliance like that, and that will help with national sovereignty.
And so in developing our
policy proposals, we looked at a set of core values that we really use to review existing international frameworks and the revisions that we propose to them. And so first and foremost, like it was previously mentioned, we wanted to really emphasize respect for national sovereignty. And so we also looked at these 3 values to create those policy proposals that were previously mentioned. So first, we wanted to strengthen accountability. When reviewing those existing international frameworks, one of the main arguments was that they don't work. They don't reach the goals that they said that they were going to, one of the main ones being the Kyoto Protocol. And so we wanted to be able to build a proposal that would be more oriented towards results rather than procedural compliance. And we also wanted to take into consideration indigenous communities, because when it comes to terms for climate change, they are the ones that are most impacted, but their voices aren't necessarily heard. And then we also wanted to focus on country committees. These localized bodies are essential for tailoring implementation strategies that will fit the needs in the context of these countries. And then we have the multilateral network, which are regional bodies that will be able to once again tailor it to the needs of the countries rather than the international body can.
Yeah, so when it comes to our rationale, we really want to make sure that sovereign states harness their autonomy and are included in genuine cooperation when it comes to any international decisions that are being made when it comes to climate change and any health concerns that are going on. So first and foremost, we saw that international negotiations require consensus among many diverse countries that can have differences in culture, politics, or overall just what they want for the country and its future, which can cause a lot of divergence in interest and conflict and make a lot of gridlock in policy making for these sovereign states. Historical examples of this we see is the Kyoto Protocol. So there was a mission to try to get a lot of major carbon emission countries down and what they were producing into the atmosphere. We saw countries, for example, China, pull out of the Kyoto Protocol because they were not able to meet the cap on how much emissions they were going to put into the atmosphere. And we as a group saw a huge issue in that these powerhouse countries who are taking up a lot of the atmosphere with carbon and the production that they produce are able to pull out of these agreements with no sort of bilateral accountability on these countries. We also found that wealthier nations are often dominating the agenda setting, funding, and rulemaking of international institutions. So like I said, these international countries, really powerful countries are coming in and really no one is able to check them on their interests and their power over poorer countries. So specifically with our proposals, one of our main proposals is to strengthen accountability for indigenous voices. So what this would look like, so right now there is the facilitative working group membership. So right now there are 14 members for the 7 United Nations tribal nations. We found that there is not enough representation for these indigenous communities, so we would want to increase that to 21 indigenous reps from the original 14 right now. This would ensure regional balance and local community rotation. We also want to amend and implement mandates for the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. So this would mean having the United Nations Declaration for Rights of Indigenous Peoples a lot more mandated. So right now that Declaration for Indigenous People is not legally binding. It is a proposal that was passed by the United Nations, but there is no sort of law making sure that this Declaration of Rights is put on and applicable to any future resolution or law that's passed when it comes to climate change or international health. So we really want to make sure that this mandate would also be including Indigenous tribes in all future decision making on a legal basis. And for establishing accountability, we also want to propose for in future council of parties coming together. We have the resolution by July 2027 that would make sure that we're monitoring states with any sort of tribal nations or minor sovereign states that they have control over and making sure that any kind of international framework is taking into account indigenous voices and local communities and their needs and wants.
All right, so our second proposal is country committees. We believe that we should take a more specific country-specific approach to this because we're trying to get away from that global collaboration. So each country has, different healthcare systems, environmental conditions, and political structures. So we believe that they are able to best know what is best for them, what they need, what they should do, and what they want for these type of things. So each country will create a committee of experts, economists, historians, and environmental engineers to come up with standards for greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals and to increase and promote public health. This will be based on this historical and cultural context because these countries are able to understand what it is that they want rather than these big international bodies that really lean towards those Western civilizations. And then countries must act on this within a specific time frame that works best for them. Not all countries are able to meet the same baseline level of production because they do not produce the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And with that, we feel like this will benefit national sovereignty, effectiveness, of course, and it will definitely help with accountability.
And then with the multilateral network, a lot of international health agreements, similarly to climate agreements, have raised concerns really about respecting national sovereignty. So with the recent pandemic agreement, Slovakia abstained from this because they felt that global health policies really and truly overstep in areas like human rights and domestic autonomy, and they are not alone in this argument. And so our proposal was to really establish these regional cooperation platforms, which are regional frameworks that would be able to help coordinate policies while respecting the sovereignty of each country. Like Edward mentioned, a lot of these countries have different political, economic, and social contexts, and those should really be taken into consideration when framing these agreements. The benefits to this are local oversight and adaptation. By developing a regional framework, we are able to enable regions to form their own committees that reflect that distinct cultural context, which will help their regional goals and regulations. And also, it will ensure transparency. Implementing reporting mechanisms will be able to support culturally appropriate public health measures. And so with this multilateral network, countries will be able to adapt and adopt culturally appropriate and effective public health measures that will be able to sort of align with those international standards.
Now that takes us through Team B's proposal and recommendations. Now folks, some of you might be worried about a decline in compromise and bipartisanship. I can tell you that this group certainly proves otherwise. Together, they came to a shared factual basis that climate change and its interrelatedness to health is an existential threat to life. So together, both operated on that factual basis to find a few bridged values.
So both of us came to these same values in our compromise and in our policy proposals. We believe that climate action needs to happen. Climate change is inevitable and the climate crisis is getting worse. We also believe in equity, justice, and fairness for these countries. You've heard a lot about developing countries, about indigenous people. These are very essential to ensure that every single voice is heard and recognized. We seek to establish strong frameworks instead of frameworks that are just pushing something just to meet a goal. Rather, we're really trying to make sure this is efficient and effective. And improve accountability and enforcement. We've seen that enforcement mechanisms are not that great. Countries can leave whenever they want. They can get back in whenever they want. So that is causing much issues, and I've even heard from law professors and things like that international law is not a thing, but we don't want that. International law is a thing, and that's because we need to make sure that we improve accountability and enforcement. All right, so both sides also agreed that international collaboration could be improved while also recognizing a state's national sovereignty as well.
Perfect. So keeping that in mind, through our compromise, we look to combine this idea presented in Team A of this international cooperation while also trying to respect the values held in Team B, which focus mainly on sovereignty. So through compromise, we decided to instate these regional committees that would act as sort of a middleman between the international system, which might be too broad and overarching, and between the countries, which might need encouraged enforcement and accountability mechanisms. So we're just going to give you a quick overview again of our original position in Group A. We had this cap and trade system, which depended on emissions tax and enforcement from the UNFCCC. And then we used IMF framework and incentivized data sharing and innovation to create more equality throughout the world in global compromise. And so to compromise, we ended up agreeing as two groups that emissions, caps, and regulations should be based off of contextual measurements instead of just population or per capita, which is what we originally had in Team A. And I think this is really beneficial to the system as a whole, so that way we can get more contextualized representation and equality in the system. We also have these national and regional organizations that work together and cooperate with the international structure, which is ultimately based off of the Paris Agreement NDC structure.
And then one aspect in Group B that we found compromise was within our suggestion to increase that FWG representation. We decided to allow the LCIPP to be elevated as a more formal role within the UNFCCC to allow them to be a part of these negotiations and allow their voices to be heard without necessarily meeting that requirement for full state membership. Like an example would be as a non-member observer. And within that strengthening accountability within the languages in these decisions, we found that mandatory language within these decisions should shift from that optional, only having to listen to their voices, as an actual goals that would be binding them to reach these obligations in order for these voices to be not only heard, but also recognized within these different groups and organizations globally.
And so then finally, we wanted to provide sort of like a visual graphic to help see how these things would come into play. So as our overarching umbrella, we do have the UNFCCC, which will handle bylaws, enforcement, and accountability. And then they'll also be in charge of handling these funds that come from the emissions taxes and ultimately helping to disperse these out across the regional and country committees. And so then from the UNFCCC, we move down into the regional bodies, which is where we see our increased representation and equality for Indigenous voices and culture-specific solutions and policies. These regional bodies will help present policy support for these countries that are within their region. And then just finally, we will have multiple countries within these regions that will submit their individual policy proposals and then receive support from the regions and additional funding from the overall UNFCCC funds. So we just want to thank you today for listening to our presentation, and a big thanks to the Henry Clay Center for everything. We had an amazing time learning compromise, and thank you.
So at this time, we will now welcome any questions.
That was a great presentation on an incredibly difficult subject. I was an energy regulator for many years at state and federal level, and I dealt with these issues not nearly as deeply as you did, but they're tough. I may have missed this in your dynamic presentation, but help me understand the ways that your plan can ensure or help ensure that powerful countries like the United States, you addressed this, in China, in India, don't go in and out and in and out and remain cooperative and a player.
That is a great question, and it's something that we had to grapple with in our discussions, both individually and in our compromise sessions. So one of the things that we were looking at was there is really no consequence for leaving, for taking advantage of the system, for abuses of power. And we were trying to level the playing field a bit more by providing both these incentives for cooperation. So being able to access this shared database of global health information, of climate innovations, and scientific developments, as well as the source of funding from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so that there is both incentive to stay and you're losing out if you leave. And I'm not sure if we touched on this, but in the interest of equity, we decided that at least, I believe the number was 50% of the fund going to the UNFCCC would be allocated to disadvantaged communities, such as small island nations, developing nations, and marginalized groups.
And just to add on like something real quick is that I think with a lot of those nations, we also wanted to make sure that there were proper incentives in place, but also because we're operating within a UN body, because the UNFCCC, for those who don't know, is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so there are certain rules and I think jurisdictions that they have to follow. So in cases where they maybe are not in alignment or maybe they're violating the policies, right? There are certain restricted policies, like maybe they lose their voting access, maybe they have sanctions placed on them, there's certain stuff like that that we can kind of enforce through those mechanisms to make sure that even the bigger players that are necessary for meaningful climate action are still playing along with everyone else.
I also think that just like when we look at previous agreements such as the Kyoto Protocol and the history of that when the US, for example, pulled out of that because they felt that they were at an economic disadvantage, many countries were incredibly displeased, and America faced a lot of political ramifications for that in the years following. And by increasing the amount of representation and also the ability to speak their voice of Indigenous communities, I think that places more of more power within the social pressure to just prioritize those countries. I think the global stage is really a stage that has a lot of power through like public image, and so I think by us making sure that they have more of a voice, the prioritization and the care of other countries for those communities would play more of a role within that social pressure.
All right. So I think you said, the moderator, what was your name?
Lexi.
Lexi, okay. You said that there was agreement at the outset that climate change is an existential threat. Okay. So I'm curious, what within the compromise, what was the most dissenting issue? Where did you find the most dissenting issue to be? What was that? And how did you get to a framework that allowed you to compromise?
So thank you so much for posing that question, sir. Where we found the most dissenting issue was actually where these regional frameworks would be placed. Because as of right now, there are regional frameworks such as the Pan American Health Organization under the United Nations. However, it became a discussion because of the top-down approach that we see right now, that there's a lot of mismanagement of funds or misallocation of funds, and also just general disagreements when you're going from such a wide range of international to national. And so when depending on where to put these regional frameworks, whether that would be under the UN or whether it would be a separate entity that the countries would decide upon, that is where our most dissenting topic was. And so how we came to a compromise on that was implementing each country having their own scientists and mathematicians and environmental engineers to then go into that regional framework, and then that regional framework would come to a overall consensus of what all of the different countries under that region agreed upon, and then send that to the United Nations so that there would be just less of confusion, as we discussed, from the top to bottom approach.
Yes, that was a great question. One of the things that we used as a model in our Team A and compromise discussions was the European climate law that came about from the European Green Deal, because it's seen great success in, doubling renewable energy, reducing emissions, and I'm so sorry. One of the things that has made it so effective is because it is regional, and there are also national committees. So each country is mandated to create it's similar to the Paris Agreement's nationally determined contributions. They create a climate plan with the goal of reaching net zero or carbon neutrality by 2050. And this allows greater contextual considerations, because one of the big issues that we found in both of our groups was that international agreements don't really set universally applicable goals. Like, one of the main things with the Kyoto Protocol was the 1990 level baseline that countries were supposed to reduce below was not necessarily fair, because there was, for example, an issue with the reunification of Germany that meant that the actual figure for carbon emissions was not what the 1990 level was. So by having this national structure that takes into account the context and circumstances, that they're then able to communicate at the regional level and then pass that on to the international organization, allows for a more equitable application, as well as the regional organizations being able to distribute funding in ways that are considerate and applicable.
Well, again, I applaud you. You did a great job with what I think is an inherently difficult topic. It seems to me you had one of a more difficult topic, because by contrast with immigration, for example, we're going to have an immigration policy, and so you can easily focus on the question of what that policy should be. In this case, you have some fundamental questions at the outset. One of them is, what is the problem, how serious is it, and what is the cause of it? Until there is a global consensus on that, you got a problem. Not only does there have to be a consensus on the problem, but there has to be a consensus on the ill effects of the people of each country, to the point where each country is willing to sacrifice some measure of its own sovereignty in order to pursue a global solution to the problem. So when you scratch the surface on this subject, you could focus on how you get from where we are to the point where there is that sort of a consensus of understanding and a willingness to sacrifice some measure of sovereignty. Alternatively, it seems to me that you could say, let's assume, even though it doesn't exist, let's assume for the moment there is that sort of a consensus. If there were, then what would we do? And it seems to me like that's where the cap and trade program comes in. The intelligent people could differ on what you would do if everyone were willing to say, we'll go along with it. And so that was the legitimate focus of a lot of your analysis, and I really appreciate that. When I turn on NPR every afternoon, somewhere in the dialogue, somebody will use the term environmental justice. And they use the term as if we all know what they're talking about. I'm not sure that I know what they're talking about. And I was listening to hear whether any of you used that term. I think you were on the same idea, but even if you didn't use the term, but I'm wondering what it means, whether that's what you were talking about, and if so, why environmental justice matters in the pursuit of what's essentially a health program, a global health program to make the environment safe for human life.
I appreciate the nuance, and I think the conversation, the question that you gave, because I think a lot of that context is really important. And I think in terms of environmental justice, I think a lot of it is looking at understanding that climate change is a global issue, it's an international issue, but its impacts are felt disproportionately across the country. So for example, let's say we have a low-income place in the United States versus a high-income in the United States. If you have something like a tornado warning, right, those people who live in that high-income area, they'll have more abilities, more resources to kind of just move and go somewhere else and kind of have that kind of resilience to also defend themselves against these kind of natural disasters. But for people that are living in those low-income areas, they don't have the necessary resilience or infrastructure to kind of resist and protect themselves against the climate change impacts of those of more affluent people would be able to. And I think that's something that we see within the fund that we were talking about, is that within our fund, we wanted to make sure that 50% or a majority of that, or a half of that money goes to countries that are developing, that are feeling the majority of the impacts of climate change. Because in the United States, we have a lot of infrastructure for example, for severe weather warming, right? But if you go to other places in the country, they won't have stuff like, if you have a tornado or a hurricane, you don't have the great protocols or infrastructure in place to defend against that. So it's making sure that there are climate change impacts everywhere, but those people that are felt and affected most disproportionately are the ones that are able to get the resources they need to kind of have that resilience and have that infrastructure to be able to survive the challenges and face climate change.
And sorry, I know we're trying to beat the clock here, but I would also say that I think that our proposal does. I think like when it comes to environmental justice, a term that comes to my mind is resilience, and we expect a community, whether it's affluent, marginalized, whether it's poor, to display resilience in the face of a natural disaster, or not even natural disaster, but an environmental crisis to any degree. And resilience really depends on what surrounds that community and the resources available at their disposal rather than like their character inherently. So I think in addition to the fact that we would have 50% of the funds allocated to countries or regions that are deemed more overburdened, we would also, by having more representation, I think that makes sure that those communities can actually speak on what it's like really for them to be hit with an environmental or public health crisis, rather than having the more top-down approach, assuming and trying to create these umbrella term standards that don't really focus on the context-specific situations and availabilities of those communities.
And folks, with that, we are at and beyond
Got one
time.
question.
Barring any
Sorry.
questions?
They said that we could ask the questions beyond the time. Very short one, though. You wisely looked at Kyoto and tried to learn from that, and that America pulled out. I've said a lot of the countries of the world. I like the suggestion of being respectful for every country, particularly, and this would include a lot of the countries that were upset when America pulled out. So how will America, did you consider what would be the enforcement mechanism to have America follow any international agreement, considering current leadership that violates, and you don't know what's going to be in office, but current leadership that violates willy-nilly what they want to do. And even if not, when you have a more stable, how do we get the strongest country in the world to follow? Did you consider that issue?
Yeah, and I appreciate the question, and I think a lot of it is looking at, for example, climate change is an inevitable issue, and I think something that we'll all have to address. I think the question that we're just trying to figure out is, when does that happen, right? Because if the U.S. doesn't address climate change right now, it's not like it's going to go away. The issues are just going to become more profound and more impacted. So it's not a question of like when they will address it. I mean, if they will address it, it's like when they'll address it. And I think also the incentive of getting places like the United States to kind of enter in these climate change agreements or do this kind of climate change work. A lot of other countries are still doing a lot of this work, even if the United States isn't, right? And so those countries don't want to be left behind. So for example, right now, China's a very big EV boom. They're doing a lot with electric cars. Even though the United States doesn't have a very strong climate change policy currently, they don't want to be left behind in the electric industry. They don't want to be left behind in this kind of work. And I think it's clear to see that even though that we don't have a clear federal policy, we still have people within the United States like David Edelman, who came to talk to us a few weeks ago, talking about the electrification of our natural grid system and talking about how there are these electric projects that are still going on, even though that we don't have a really strong federal backing of this kind of climate policy.
Let's give this group a round of applause.
Thank you, James.
Good morning, judges. Good morning, members of the Henry Clay Center, policy mentors, participants, and any other audience members. Thank you for your time today. We are the representatives for the Defense Alliance Policy Group, and today we want to present to you our reconciled policy, which is our pivot without abandonment. Europe holds the line while America turns east. So first, I would like to introduce our incredible team. Team A was tasked with doing a multilateralist policy, slowly pivoting to Asia, and that consisted of Jordan Brown, Caitlin Cherry, Parker Davis, Emily Kessler, Will Kwietniak, and myself, Sienna Pilati. Team B had a unilateralist stance and a hard pivot to Asia in terms of defense, and that was Parker Easel, Quinn Long, Avery McIntyre, Ed Nagler, Logan Pierce, and Caitlin Tran. So we have 2 Caitlins and 2 Parkers, so if you can keep that straight. So first, we're going to have each team explain their premise, their stances on what multilateralism and unilateralism is. So I'm going to turn it over to Team A's representative, which is Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Sienna. So, Team A's policy is grounded in multilateralism, meaning that the U.S. does not act alone, but rather in cooperation with trusted partners. So this means that we were prioritizing cooperation, but also stable development. And additionally, we support a slow pivot to Asia. Well, what does that look like? Gradually reallocating sources from Europe and transitioning them over to Asia. But we wanted to ensure primarily that Europe is able to stand on its own and that we're able to keep their commitments. But we needed to be proactive in looking towards Asia and the Indo-Pacific region. Now, before we continue, we just wanted to go over a couple of key terms and some military jargon so this can be broken down easier. To start, there's gray zones. This is primarily talked about, and we'll talk about it in the cybersecurity context. It is the intermediary between peace and war. So, for example, let's say Russia launches a misinformation campaign. While that isn't exactly harmful to the physical, it is harmful in some regards to our people and what we stand for policy-wise. We also have Indo-PACOM, which is the U.S. combatant command of the Indo-Pacific region, alongside the U.S. Cybercom, which is also another combatant command dedicated to cybersecurity. And then we have CERT, which is Computer Emergency Response Teams. The United States has one along with many other nations. Now, our first policy recommendation is called C, Security Through Engaged Alliances. With Asia, we wanted to be proactive, especially in regards to the now considered AI arms race. But as we mentioned, there is a little bit of an issue with these gray zones. So, for example, many United States companies, such as Microsoft and Google, have already moved to areas in the region, such as Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, when thinking about building things called data centers. Data centers hold valuable data for US and other allies, but they are also physical pieces of infrastructure. We wanted to ensure that we are keeping these data centers secure because there are assets to the United States, but the issue is that even 10 years ago, they're already being located there. That is why Team A wanted to establish a multilateral cyber threat innovation hub, which would be facilitated by Indo-PACOM, which would invite areas of CERT teams to collaborate and ensure that there are joint operations we are keeping an eye. Because of the physicality of this issue, we also wanted to establish a trusted infrastructure zone. As many other presentations have touched on, climate is another issue. With these infrastructure zones, the U.S. would be in collaboration with the host countries of these data centers, setting norms and standards for the zones in which data centers would be constructed. Now, because we already have some data centers located in these vulnerable areas in this region, we also wanted to ensure that in the future, because of domestic policies, whether it be land room cost, we wanted to ensure that there's incentives for US companies to either deploy these data centers back home in somewhere safe, or to use these TRZs and create a certification which they would receive for secure housing or a tax break. And finally, We wanted to expand the U.S. Cybercom presence by collaborating with Indo-PACOM to place a new headquarters in Guam. This way, we are essentially looking at drawing those physicality borders, but also paying attention to the vulnerabilities that AI and these data centers have in terms of U.S. security. Now, we have institutional measures to safeguard alliances. Team A wanted to create a tier system to encourage increased defense spending from European nations, ensure that they're up to standard, but we also wanted to ensure that we are taking into account our alliance duration and also the percentage of GDP in terms of defense funding so that we can allocate those resources and pull back in a proper manner. And additionally, we also wanted to clarify some legal gray space regarding treaties and pulling out of treaties, for example, joint Congress approval or a 2/3 Senate majority vote, which you'll see in talks of NATO.
Thank you, Caitlin. For Team B's representatives, we have Ed and Quinn, who are going to outline what they mean by unilateralism and their policy.
So for Team B, we define unilateralism as a grand strategy by which the U.S. acts independently to ultimately pursue its self-interests. Unilateralism isn't per se anti-alliances, but recognizes that alliances are means and not ends to achieve U.S. interests, and prioritizes alliances in accordance to that. It prioritizes flexibility, speed, control, and autonomy. We believe that a hard pivot to Asia is necessary, which would entail a rapid shift of the United States to the Indo-Pacific. And it would require a major drawdown in European commitments, and ultimately with the objective of deterring the PRC through a forward-leaning posture. We believe that the rise of China, which could parallel the threat posed to the United States by the Soviet Union, requires decisive U.S. action. There are reports that Xi Jinping wants the PLA to have at least the capability to invade Taiwan by 2027, so we must act quickly. Multilateralism, we fear, slows response to promoting collective action problem, where countries don't want to spend on their own defense and rely on the United States, as seen in NATO. We believe that a heightened security environment, as well as declining U.S. defense spending, requires the United States to make hard choices and prioritize Asia.
Thank you, Edward. For our policy group B unilateralist perspective, we believe in 3 main policy areas. Our first is an 80% reduction of troops in Europe over 5 years. This means that 88,000 troops currently in Europe will drop to 17,000 troops in Europe, sending 71,000 troops to Asia. We also believe that we should remain in NATO, but reduce its presence to pressure Europe into rearmament. And lastly, we want to disinvite IP4 members from annual NATO summit. But I personally want to talk about ending all aid to Ukraine completely. Group B believes that we should end aid completely to Ukraine. The US has given Ukraine $128 billion since February of 2022, which should be sent to better causes like defending Asia. You might be asking yourself, $128 billion has bought us what exactly? More war? We're not defending freedom. We're sponsoring failure. Group B also believes in imposing Ukraine NATO membership. If we allow Ukraine to join NATO, the US would have to go to war for Ukraine if Russia attacks again. This would put the US at an insurmountable security risk. The US would not defend Ukraine, which would weaken the validity of NATO. Group B also believes in European responsibility. Europe is treating Uncle Sam like Uncle Sucker. By withdrawing aid, the US forces Ukraine to reach a compromise faster and stop being dependent on US aid and stop continuing this horrible war. On the next slide, you can see a graph. And on the left, you can see that during the Cold War, the US needed to play a bigger role to defend the EU because the USSR was outspending the EU. However, today we can see dramatically Europe is outspending its military compared to Russia and can defend itself. Europe's $22 trillion GDP is 10 times Russia's GDP. Judges, do you know what Russia's GDP is? Russia has a GDP. Russia has a GDP smaller than the country of Italy. Russia is not a big threat. Group B, Unilateralist Policy Group, believes that we need the US to stop funding Ukraine so European countries can pick up their slack and get a wake-up call, increase their spending, and become self-reliant. Judges, it's time to pay up or pack up.
All right, so recognizing our hard pivot to Asia requires the United States to strengthen its bilateral ties in the region. Now, we want the United States to maintain its hub-and-spoke model, where it rejects multilateral frameworks like NATO that dilute U.S. autonomy and foster collective action problems like we see in Europe right now, where it took a really long time for a lot of countries to hit that 2% benchmark. We believe that the United States can reallocate those 71,000 troops to Asia, including in Japan, the South Korea, the Philippines, and Guam. And we want to expand joint exercises like the Balakatan with the Philippines to really build up our interoperability in the region. Now, we also recognize the importance of really helping Europe build up its defense capabilities. So you want to accelerate the arms transfers process by pursuing reforms in the international traffic and arms regulations process. This process regulates all commercial defense sales not managed by the US government and allows countries to basically import defense technologies. Now, this review process can take up to 18 months because basically you're reviewing to see if it's secure enough to transfer it to an ally. But we recently issued a license to exempt AUKUS from this, and we think that we can do the same for Europe and NATO. We also want to prioritize foreign military sales, which are sales managed by the US government for finished US defense systems, away from Europe and towards Asia, recognizing that we want to help Europe build up its own defense industrial base instead of relying on finished US products. Right now, Taiwan has a $21.1 billion arms backlog. That's all weapons they have paid for and purchased. The United States has failed to deliver. And we believe that we must prioritize filling these contracts instead of replacing them with new European ones to fulfill critical readiness gaps and achieve our ultimate goal of deterring the PRC.
Next, we'll be moving into negotiations. Clearly, our two groups have very diverging views, so we will be reconciling the unilateral perspective of Group B and the multilateral perspective of Group A. So to firstly talk about the timeline, this was one of our most contentious issues, given that one group advocates for a hard pivot and the other group advocates for a slow pivot. So Team A's position was that they wanted a 15 to 20-year exit from US leadership in NATO. And in order to enable this exit, they would develop a tiered incentivization system so that Europe would be able to build up its defenses within this given timeline. Team B, however, as previously mentioned, wanted a significantly shorter timeline. They wanted a 80% reduction of US forces in Europe over 5 years compared to 15 to 20 years. That would lead to a decrease from around 88,000 to 17,000 troops. Therefore, we had a very significant compromise to make here, which our group talked through multiple different negotiations and caucuses. And we ultimately decided to phase out an exit from Europe, in which we would cut 10% of ordnance and personnel in 3 years, 35% in 6 years, and 50% in 20 years. The compromise that we can see here is that we do have a longer timeline. However, most of the reduction is conducted within the first 6 years. The reasoning for this, our Ukraine policy. So Team A's position on Ukraine evidently was to continue firm US support of Ukraine, moderating the tensions between Ukraine and Russia. Team B's position, on the other hand, was to completely end aid for Ukraine and restrict the country from joining NATO. As you can see, these are very different positions, and our group had to work very hard in order to compromise and negotiate the situation. So ultimately, we decided upon a practical solution to continue providing aid for Ukraine. However, we would focus this assistance on defending Ukraine's currently held territory. We would therefore concede the territories already controlled by Russia. And this also aligns with our timeline, given that we would have troops in Europe for longer, however, have the majority of the reduction in the first 6 years. So therefore, we were very considerate in terms of ensuring that our two significant priorities overlapped with one another.
So with this compromise, there were parts of the policies that were able to remain intact. For Team A, which we'll talk about in depth a little bit more later, we wanted to ensure that there wouldn't be an unofficial or official withdrawal from NATO from the US, and that was a big part for Team A, as well as our C policy, which was a major part of our policy in general, so we wanted to ensure it could stay as intact as possible. For Team B, their FMS and ITAR parts of their policies were able to remain intact. Now, slide please. Reasoning for our concessions. For Group A C policy was a big bargaining chip, so we were able to make compromises on the timeline while maintaining that C policy. We were able to make concessions and find a spot in the middle regarding withdrawing our troops from Europe and adjusting the timeline of the withdrawal. And finally, Ukraine was a contentious subject, but we were able to agree that we would maintain support for Ukraine in the current regions where Ukraine is fighting, as well as not support Ukraine joining NATO.
Thank you, judges. I look forward to sharing our final policy with you alongside Logan Pierce. In regards to Europe, we are shifting the burden away from U.S. troops. We have identified 7 Western European countries selected using our tiered metric system based off of defense budget as percent of GDP, as well as the length of alliance. Those 7 countries are the United Kingdom, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. From these countries, 10% of troops will be removed in 3 years, 35% of all troops will be removed in 6 years, which is 50% from all 7 of those countries. And then 50% of troops from all of Europe in total will be removed in 20 years, with an additional 25% being removed from all the countries listed above, except for the United Kingdom. Additionally, we plan to maintain the status quo on nuclear weaponry in Europe, given the potential threat of Russia. In regards to Ukraine, we are supporting a ceasefire surrounding the Ukrainian land that is currently held. We also oppose Ukraine's ascension into NATO, as we see that as a potential security risk. Lastly, there's continued support for the defense of their currently held territory via military aid.
The United States should relocate withdrawn European military resources as part of reaffirming the pre-existing bilateral security agreements that are currently in place within the Indo-Pacific region. The Mutual Defense Treaty between the Republic of the Philippines and the United States, and the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between the United States and Japan allow the U.S. to station troops and maintain physical military bases in both nations. As part of the existing provisions of the treaties, troops and military resources such as artillery systems withdrawn from Europe should be moved to both Japan and the Philippines to facilitate the overall pivot to Asia. Additionally, European troops and resources should be relocated to military sites located within Guam, considering its strong strategic importance within the region as well. To support these transitions, the United States will reform the international traffic and arms regulations by extending exemptions, currently limited to AUKUS partners in Canada, to key NATO and Indo-Pacific allies. This will accelerate private defense technology sales and licensing, helping Europe strengthen its own defense industrial base. Instead of relying on the foreign military sales system, which reinforces European dependence on U.S. platforms, the U.S. will prioritize direct commercial sales. At the same time, the U.S. will prioritize clearing Taiwan's $21.1 billion FMS backlog, recognizing that new FMS agreements with NATO allies and only prolong delays in fulfilling Taiwan's critical defense needs. To ensure a sustainable pivot to Asia, the U.S. should also build trusted relations in the region. The Security Through Engaged Alliances policy outlines 4 foundational pillars to enhance U.S. security. Creation of a multilateral cyber threat innovation hub facilitated by Indo-PACOM, invite CERT to collaborate, establishing trusted infrastructure zones, incentivizing U.S. data center deployment via the use of TRZs to create a secure housing certification, expanding U.S. cybercom presence by collaborating with Indo-PACOM, as well as placement of new headquarters in Guam.
And then I'll wrap up our policy focusing on our more domestic changes. The U.S. Department of Defense budget shall be increased to 4% of our GDP within the next 5 years. That's approximately $1.1 trillion based off of our current GDP. That's on track with what the current administration is doing in terms of budget, with a slight increase. Additionally, we are hoping to limit executive actions to withdraw the United States from a mutual defense or security treaty unless authorized by either a joint resolution of Congress or 2/3 vote of the Senate. This has been a long legal question with lots of gray area, and we're finally putting an end to that to ensure our alliances are maintained. And we'll turn it over to Will for our Q&A.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Will, representing the state of Maryland, and I'd be happy to field any questions from the panel of judges.
All right, you're going to go second. Okay, so clearly this is an issue that's not at all timely, and there's no passion whatsoever related to it. So I'm curious, there are 12 of you all. Was it 6 and 6? Okay.
Yes, sir.
So in your decision, or in your compromise, would you describe that compromise, those conversations, those engagements, those sidebars, as collaborative or as being influenced by a very few of you?
I would definitely say.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
No, please finish.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
I would definitely say, as a group of Henry Clay scholars, we are definitely an impassioned group. So there definitely was a bit of negotiation that had to go around. But in the end, I think it really came down to just pure compromise in the sense that we needed to understand that a solution needs to be reached to a certain degree. The world is moving, or the United States specifically, is moving to a one-war policy. And we genuinely cannot afford and cannot really rationally sustain a two-war policy to be fought on two fronts, especially in the superpower theater with near-peer adversaries like Russia and China. So in the end, we were able to pretty concisely come up with a bit of a protocol, but obviously the process is very complex.
With or without a sort of a single razorback gorilla leading this?
I would
compromise.
say there was a good 4 silverback gorillas, but you know, like, I mean, come on. And at that point,
not
isn't
12,
that just government?
but 4? Okay.
Yeah.
So, and my last question, did anybody feel, hold your hand up, did anybody feel like you gave up too much in the compromise? Nope. Everybody, wow, that's impressive.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, this is an area of some interest to me. And I guess whether intended or not, it seemed to me as if the dialogue sort of focuses on a Ukraine and Europe on the one hand versus China and the Pacific Rim on the other. The question is which are our priorities as a matter of national interest, and do we need to make a shift? It seemed to me as if the answer to that question was yes from both sides. And I guess a threshold question is whether you can vigorously pursue both at the same time. It seemed to me as if your thought was no, and you're probably right as a matter of domestic politics. So, but I guess what I'm looking for is some sort of a logic and rationale for why you make that shift. And here are my thoughts. Number one, are you saying that there's something inherently more important about Taiwan than there is about Ukraine? If so, why? If the question is not who's more important, but whether there are other players in the international scene who could pick up the defense of Ukraine so that our response is not really needed, we can rely on others to do that. Are you planning on getting an assurance from those other players before you unilaterally withdraw? Or are you saying we're going to withdraw anyway, and if our European partners decide not to pursue the defense of Ukraine, then it's on you, it's not us? I mean, are we really willing to do that? If we are relying on other players to come in and defend Ukraine, then why would we not likewise rely on Australia and India and Indonesia and Japan to defend Taiwan and not us? Why do we have to be the principal actor where the defense of Taiwan is concerned and not rely on others as you're proposing that we do in Europe? And there is an interconnection, at least in my mind, between the two, and that is that if the United States is seen as having abandoned its commitment to Ukraine, I'm wondering what the signal is to the people who might have an interest in Taiwan. My fear is that the signal would be that there's a limit to how long and how much America is willing to provide as a deterrent to aggression. The deterrence in the case of Ukraine didn't work. So, and now we're left to clean it up. But we're also left with the question of whether we want to reward bad behavior or not. And it seems to me that if the rationale for all of the shifted priority to Asia is that we want to deter aggression there, particularly against Taiwan, why did we not see that that's exactly what we failed to do in Ukraine and that we're now abandoning it in the middle of the fight? Those are my thoughts. And you can tell I'm sort of partisan on this point, but I'm interested. I mean, it's a question that has to be answered, isn't it? How do you justify that?
That was a large part of our negotiation, mainly in that giving up some support in Ukraine would kind of reward Russia. To quote Winston Churchill, you can't rationale with a tiger while your head's in its mouth. So that was kind of our rationality for only taking 50% out over 20 years. The Russian war chest will end at a certain point, and while that is happening, we can support a self-sufficiency inside of Europe that, while initially non-beneficial for Ukraine, I think it can allow for a greater Europe on the whole, that the United States doesn't really need to have all of these suckling pigs at them really looking for their money. On top of that, what you're saying is a Taiwan and China issue. We never really fully explicitly said Taiwan is the main issue. Of course, the Taiwanese Strait is a huge issue in geopolitical Indo-Pacific conflict, but on top of that, China is generally an aggressor in many stances. Indonesia, the Philippines, Taiwan, Thailand, Myanmar, India, all of these are genuine concerns that China in the past has had border clashes with. That is just the area that is going to be heating up is now China. And while Russia, we know its capabilities after fighting a Ukrainian war for 3 years and understand, yeah, we can pay for this war, we can pay for somebody else to fight our war here. Are we sure we have that in the Southeast Asian arena? We're not so sure. On top of that, Australia is geopolitically so far away from China that we don't really, and while we do have roughly 50,000 troops in Japan and Australia already, aim to move in case of a potential invasion of Taiwan, to say the difference in space is kind of an issue that we need to address more with acumen inside of the Philippines, inside of Korea, inside of Japan. And while it is obviously necessary to have a commitment to Europe, a large part of our compromise was in a slow, a negative exponential curve away from supporting Europe, just because it's not fair to the American taxpayer in a certain sense. Of course, Europe needs to be defended. Of course, Russia needs to be put in its place. Hell, it's got 6,000 nuclear weapons. Of course, Russia needs to be understood that they can be taken to cost when it comes down to it. But is that the full role of the United States while the rest of the world is moving outside of that? We negotiated and mediated that in this day and age, it is necessary to move some focus, if not all, to the Asian theater. Thank you.
Thank you all for this robust discussion and your work on this very important topic. Now, did the group first study history, particularly World War? Did you really study the Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods Conference, America's central role in creating the successful world we have now in defense? The group did that. Is that correct? Yes. I'm gathering, but I want to ask: did the whole group agree that China was the enemy to be feared and confronted and treated like an enemy?
Well, generally, the defense and espionage industry has been moving towards China as an emerging threat. We can see that on all fronts, and generally that their reciprocal tariffs to us, as well as their indifference to environmental regulation and their island-making process in the South China Sea has showed an aggression already. Not to mention the physical border clashes with India along the Nepalese Strait and throughout the Himalayas has generally inclined us to believe that there is a worry around this. On top of that, through military research, we understand that within the next 8 years, China is planning an invasion to Taiwan direct from Xi Jinping.
But to Brad, and you took the question out of my mouth, I saw a conflict between the way the group viewed Taiwan vis-a-vis China, and Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia. Russia clearly an aggressor nation, China clearly not. Yes, borders, that's another discussion. But did the group agree that China was an aggressor nation? Did the whole group, liberal and conservative? Okay. This was very intriguing to me, and because it's been on my mind for a long time, most of my life, and that is one war policy versus two war policy. Why not a no war policy? Was that considered at all?
I would definitely say that was considered, especially by the unitary side. Group B really focused on that kind of initial thought. In a world, though, that is plagued by a new age of tyranny and autocracy, we did agree that it was necessary for the United States to have a hand in geopolitical affairs. Beyond that, what are we doing at that certain point? We need to be some kind of defender of democracy. While we don't need to overstretch our taxpayer dollars or be called to cost for other nations fully, we should be able to keep ourselves in the top of the geopolitical train.
Defender of democracy?
To a degree, yeah.
I grew up with that, of course. Yeah. Now, but do you consider Russia a democracy? Did the group consider that?
No, absolutely not. The shift is that while we do still support Ukraine and support Ukrainian sovereignty, the issue in the Donbass and Crimea regions of Ukraine are uniquely different. They are a separate entity that in past polling has been determined to be somewhat favorable to the Russian side. So while we would not give current territory that Ukraine still has hung on to for 3 years, miraculously, we would have to cede a portion of Ukraine to Russia, although after taking them to task with a huge military response that has really shown that Russia is incapable of fully launching a land invasion.
I really like your compromise on the European situation. So, and I applaud you all for showing the way forward that we can, all your groups, how we can reach resolution through civil discourse. Thank you.
Thank you.
One more.
Yes, ma'am.
So, as I listened carefully to the presentations, my initial thought was that's pretty radical, shifting to Asia away from NATO. So I don't know if there would be a big policy declaration made by DOD or state or even the White House, but as a point to help me understand better, is the pivot more on the military, cyber, trade imbalance, or more on the social aspects, improving cooperation? Is it more on seeing Asia as a growing factor?
Thank you very much for the question. I would definitely say that it's more on the cyber and defensive stance. Do you have a follow-up, sir? Oh, great. Okay. I would definitely say it's more on the cyber and defensive stance, just because we are moving around kind of little green men on the map here that we're looking at. Asia is definitely becoming more of a theater, especially for cyber warfare and the rising.
More of a what?
It's becoming.
Theater? What was your answer?
Theater, yeah, more of a theater for, yeah, my apologies. Becoming more of a theater for the AI revolution, and kind of this entire idea of moving wars more online is becoming such a rising factor in such stance in the modern world that we are shifting personnel and military assets, while still, of course, Europe is one of our greatest friends, which is why we are only taking 50% over 20 years, which out of a developed nation should be generally possible given our past history extracting from Europe in World War II versus, say, withdrawing from Afghanistan.
So that helps me understand the policy rationale better. Thank you.
Glad I could help. Yeah. One more.
Yeah, real quick. So, which team were you on?
Team A.
Team A. Okay. So how were you? So that was a compromise for you to be chosen as the spokesperson, in a sense, right? Did that occur? Was that a universe? How did you all make that decision?
We just wanted to have a point person.
Okay.
And I mean, we worked together so much throughout the week that we all became knowledgeable about
Great. Good deal. Thank you. You all are the future leaders, and I have great respect for that, and prayers and promise and hope. I just want to say this. One thing that the one war versus two war, I know we have to be realistic. I don't believe in self-fulfilling prophecies. And if I'm going to prophesy anything, it's going to be positivity, peace, bending over, being conciliatory, not, as Roosevelt said, not taking, walking, but with a gentle way, not with a heavy stick. We carry it, but we don't have to show it. And we can concede so much to other nations and concede so much to weaker nations without hurting ourselves. And that's what the Marshall Plan did, and we all became stronger. So I do encourage that thought process and not succumb to fear and over-reliance on weapons and the need for security. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Not here, so you got the backup team. We're going to try to figure this out. Do we know if, well, now we just have email pulled up. It should be in here somewhere? Yeah, right. Okay, well, I'll try to black out the screen. Yeah, please. Is this Abby's email? Do you have a suggestion? Policy proposition? Letters right there, right? Is this it? This is it? Okay. We're good. Oh, yeah, it's on both screens too. Are my judges ready? Or are y'all still filing through papers? Awesome. Thank you. Yes, I can. That's a pretty good idea. Good morning. Let's try that again. Good morning. There we go. I've always wanted to do that. Welcome to the final presentation of Henry Clay's College Congress Policy Center's propositions. My name's Christian Caston. I'm going to be your moderator for the trade and tariff policy. Our project today is Made in America, Rebuilding the Middle Class. So let's get right into it. We had two teams, like every other group. We had Team A, which is going to take a more protectionist and more isolationist approach. On these teams, we have Jonathan Blankenship, Ethan Chu, Hayden Curtis, Johnny Russell, Michelle No, and Ty Lloyd. On the more globalist approach, we had Colin Bannister, myself, Tucker Pay, Alexandria Thomas, Robbie Traore, and Logan Walsh. So, throughout the next 15 to 20 minutes or so, hopefully if we can stay on time, we're going to show you a couple of things. We're going to talk about the historical context, about tariffs, how we got to where we are, and what the emerging problem actually and fundamentally is. Next, we're going to take a quick overview onto what both teams' proposals were originally, what the isolationists in their ideal world would have gotten, and what the globalists in their ideal world would have gotten. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how the sausage was made and how the horses were traded and what overall the compromise came to be. So, to discuss a little bit about Group A's policy proposal and what fundamentally is protectionism, I'm going to bring up Jonathan and Michelle. Take it away. Ooh, I'm so sorry. This is Colin with exactly how we came to be on tariffs and how our policy currently is.
Yep, so I'll give some historical context background. We can go ahead and start with the slides. You can move one. So really, Pre and post World War II are really the main ways of thinking about tariffs, or pre-recession, post-recession. From 1790 up until 1930s, the Great Recession, tariffs were seen as a great way to collect revenue for the U.S. government, create lots of American production and jobs. But then when the Great Recession hit, a lot of changes had happened not only in the U.S. economy, but the global stage. Things were a lot more interconnected, a lot more travel, shipping, global economy. So when Congress had the recession happen, their reaction was to pass the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and that essentially raised tariffs on other nations. Economists mostly agree that the tariffs themselves did not make the Great Depression worse, but what did was the retaliatory tariffs that we got from our trading partners across the world. And what we see from that is a turning point from protectionism to a more globalist-based economy in the world. And the U.S. follows that. So post-World War II, we see a lot of trade agreements start up, with some of the most recent ones being NAFTA and the World Trade Organization in the 90s, and just in general, a lot more interconnectedness with global trade. And then you can go to the next one. This kind of shows that change in U.S. policies based on the tariff rate on imports. You can see right after the Great Recession, tariff rates fall quite dramatically. And one of the consequences of that, however, though, is that we also have shifted from being a production society to being more of a consumer society, relying more on the global market for a lot of our goods and resources from competitors like China. Now, bringing it to more current times, Trump administration really brought forward some of the most major tariff and trade policy changes in nearly a century. In his first term, he established some targeted tariffs on things like solar panels, steel, and aluminum. This was with the ideology of creating a more protectionism to enhance U.S. industry in these fields and protect it from foreign competition. Biden continued these policies, and now with the second Trump administration, we have an even bigger shakeup in trade policy. 10% blanket tariff on all imports into the U.S. from most countries, 30% tariffs currently on imports from China, which is a direct competitor with us, and even 25% tariffs on good allies in trade like Canada and Mexico. And then another point that I really want to touch on is not only that it's changed, but it's changed quite a lot in quite a short amount of time. There's been a lot of volatility in the type of tariffs and trade policies that we've pursued. So that top graph showing China is kind of a timeline of what rate the tariff was set at different times. So it jumped from like 10% all the way above to 145%, and now it's at 30%. What this really means for global and U.S. economies is a lot of uncertainty. Investors and a lot of other people entering the workforce aren't certain of where the economy is going to be sitting because trade and tariff policy is so volatile right now. So that's kind of the stage that we're in right now. And then going more towards broader what the problem both protectionist and globalist ideas currently clashing are trying to address is really the shrinking of the middle class. So we've seen from the 70s on pretty drastic decline in amount of American wealth held by the middle class. And the argument essentially is, does free trade agreements and better connected trade help the middle class? Or do, blanket tariffs, such as what the Trump administration is doing, is that going to help build the economy and bring back our jobs and the wealth of the middle class? So now I'll pass it back to Christian.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Colin. So now that we have a pretty good understanding and have diagnosed our problem in a pretty significant way, let's see what the isolationists actually decided on what they would like as our solution. So for that, I'm going to bring up, I can't see, Jonathan and Michelle.
Thank you, Christian. Yes, so next slide, please. So Team A, yeah, we kind of talked about the protectionism side of things. So what is protectionism? Imagine you are a small shoe factory here in the United States, and you're competing against cheaper goods cheaper shoes, for example, from other countries that is being imported into the U.S. You can't compete with those prices, and because of that, your business starts to struggle, and that's where protectionism comes into play. Protectionism is where the government steps in to help local businesses by implementing and helping limit the foreign competition. With that, we sought out tariffs and implementing tariffs on those imported goods to be able to balance out the prices between the imported goods and the goods made here in the U.S. to help our products and our industries here in the U.S. The goal would be to build domestic jobs, to strengthen and to help our national security within areas like technology or defense, and overall to help with building the U.S. economy. With that, protectionism is supposed to help bring the tariffs are supposed to help bring the imported goods and help the U.S. economy in the way to be able to be able to stimulate that domestic production of the prices on the imported goods. Slide, thank you. Protection. So now that we know a little bit about protectionism, protection from foreign competition. So post NAFTA, the lowered wages depleted. In 2011, international trade depressed wages for non-college educational workers by 5.5%, which costed $1,800 per year for those workers. The decreased employment between 1997 and 2022, an estimated 70,000 U.S. manufacturing jobs were lost. And so to be able to use those tariffs, to be able to bring those jobs back and to support our U.S. economy is kind of our goal in our Team A. And I'll let Michelle talk a little bit more about that. So thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So you've heard a little bit about the background of tariffs and also where we are now. We heard from Colin that we have tariffs in place. We've seen it in the news. We have a blanket tariff of 10%, more or less, higher for some countries. But this is what we propose, a 20% blanket tariff on all imported goods from every country. A lot of the problem now is that these generated revenue, it's unclear where it goes. We don't know how it benefits me, how it benefits you, all of us, those we love, and that's the problem. So we are earmarking these tariffs. We're having them go towards a Made in America fund, where 50% of all annual tariff revenue will go into this fund, and it's allocated specifically to get people back into the industry, back working, get their jobs back that we've lost previously. These funds will go towards direct payments towards manufacturers. It could also go towards vocational job training programs, and this is efficient and effective. We want people to get back into the economy soon. Instead of a 4-year education, they can join these programs and then get back their jobs. The lack of tariffs has kind of caused this decline in the American industry, and there's a responsibility on the government to get their jobs back. We can also include anti-dumping duties to ensure that all businesses are on a fair playing field and to kind of promote the American industries. So it's not just tariffs, it's more of a transformation of the entire economy.
Awesome, thank you so much. So there's always two sides to a coin though, so let's see what the globalist perspective and their team proposal was. And for that, I'm bringing up Tucker and Logan.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you for everyone for being here. Your presentations have been incredibly impressive, and that's made me very nervous. So to get into the definition of globalism, without reading verbatim from the slide, I just wanted to really make it clear that we're trying to build an interdependent country, a country that relies on international trade to build our strength, instead of an independent country where we cut ourselves off for the rest of the world. Now to move on to why tariffs are not the solution. When we put these trade barriers for our country. While there is a role for them in protecting domestic production, it does come with some significant trade-offs. That includes consumers paying the price for these rising prices. When we tax these imports, we can't expect for foreign companies to just eat the cost. That's not a realistic outcome. That's going to be passed on to our consumers. The second trade-off is that we are going to see sacrificing comparative advantage in order to diversify our industry. And when we put blanket tariffs on our economy, we really want to spur production across the board. And unfortunately, we really should be focusing on sectors where America has a more efficient production than other countries. That's free trade, David Ricardo, comparative advantage. And finally, retaliatory tariffs. This may come as a shock, but when we put taxes on other countries, they like to put taxes back on us. Now, that really hurts our domestic firms who are producing products for our exports, and it hurts our overall GDP. Now, the bottom line is, excuse me, the middle class is shrinking, and recent administration actions to raise tariffs across the board, and especially on our biggest trading partners, will raise prices for the American consumer. This is not desirable for increasing our economic mobility and overall economic benefit.
Thank you for that, Tucker. So to give you the approach that we took, we did a three-prong approach here. So first of all, we started with where's going to provide the most stability. We go back to the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. Congress has the authority over tariff. As Colin explained, over the past 100 years, they've slowly delegated that over to the executive branch as we become more interconnected. While there are benefits with that, the executive branch can respond more effectively to crises as they arise around the world. There also requires some balance there. So our first proposal was congressional oversight, imposing a sunset period on any new tariffs imposed by the executive branch of a 60-day period. This brings both branches of government back into play on tariff policy. It forces the clock on Congress to within a 60-day period to vote a resolution affirming the tariffs, otherwise they will expire. Why would we do this? We want to create stability with our trading partners. If we're asking countries to come back and build and create jobs for the middle class in the United States, they want stability. They want to know that they have a solid return on investment. But if at the stroke of a pen, we go to 194% tariffs on a certain country, they aren't going to come. Second of all, that goes to our second point of removing blanket tariffs. We want to spur innovation in the United States. The best way to do that is remove trade barriers. Once again, we want FDI. We want countries creating domestic jobs here, and the best way to do that is remove trade barriers, excuse me. So costs are reducing for consumers and also for producers. And to further that idea of free trade, we want to engage more multilateral trade agreements. We want to partner up with countries where we see emerging industries, such as the tech industry. Pursue multilateral trade agreements with partners, strategic partners around the world where we can secure supply chain networks of important inputs at low cost and maintain stability throughout. And all this is going to result in lower prices for the American middle class and increased job production back home.
Awesome. Thank you so much, y'all. So now we're actually going to look at, since we have a pretty good idea of both sides of the coin, we're going to look at what the overall compromise was and how we got there. So for that, I'm going to bring up Hayden, and we're going to bring back up Tucker.
Thank you so much, Christian. So how did we get here? In seeking our compromise, it was pretty evident that we had a lot of ways in which our goals and our values aligned. However, we also did encounter some setbacks. We immediately noticed that we both agreed on the same problem, the shrinking middle class. However, we had a little bit of a different idea of how to go about it. We also, both groups had ambitions for reinvesting the funds into growing that middle class back to where it used to be. Some setbacks that we encountered was just general partisanship differences along all of the groups, as well as the role of tariffs in the American economy and whether or not they should exist at all. Shifting gears to talk about what our specific compromises were, both groups agreed that there definitely needs to be more congressional oversight in the role of tariffs and trade in our economy. However, there was a little bit of a difference to what degree. Group B felt like there needed to be a lot of oversight, whereas Group A was a little bit unsure of how it should be handled at all. We decided to meet in the middle, and we decided to amend the IEEPA to implement a 60-day sunset policy, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. In terms of sacrifices, Group A sacrificed their idea of having a blanket tariff in order to continue the Made in America Fund. And Group B sacrificed their ideas of complete removal of all trade and tariff barriers, and they kind of had to let go of the idea of completely open market. Overall, we kind of came to the main general compromises of multilateral agreements and targeted tariffs on specific industries such as electric vehicles. I'm going to start us off and talk about the first policy that we agreed on initially, was the increased congressional oversight. So that already in existence is the International Emergency Economic Protection Act, and what we want to implement is a 60-day sunset period. This gives Congress 60 days to pass an affirmative solution supporting these emergency tariffs. So what this does is it ensures that action is taken effectively and immediately, and that powers are being checked, and that policies aren't getting pushed off to the side and collecting dust, and that action is being taken, and that the powers of the executive branch are checked. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I wanted to talk about what the actual benefit of tariffs are. By reducing tariffs to their best suited purpose, which is protecting domestic industry, we can maximize their potential while minimizing their risk. America may be able to introduce or expand manufacturing, which will allow domestic suppliers to sell our products without being forced out by more established foreign competition. We decided on a 20% minimum through compromise. We had a 20% blanket tariff at the start, and this seemed like a good compromise with our targeted tariffs. Now, the specific industries that we may be looking to put these tariffs on are the legacy semiconductors, battery products, and electric vehicles. These sectors are incredibly important for the modern age and our future, and we believe that America can expand their market power in these specific industries. Now, how are they going to do that? Well, let's get into our multilateral agreements. We had 4 specific goals we wanted to do with our multilateral agreements. The first one is that we wanted to target countries that had strategic resources beyond what we were already had partnerships with. Now, for specific inputs, we tend to rely on the majority of the input coming from one partner. Now, if the relations with that partner starts to degrade, we could see that input put at risk. Maybe it'll become more expensive, maybe we'll get less of it, maybe we'll stop getting it at all. So we need to expand to other countries. That can include Australia, Indonesia, Chile. There are a lot of countries that have specific rare earth materials that we can use and diversify our network in order we can have a more resilient economy, especially in our manufacturing. Now, if we have stable supply lines, we have economic resilience, and America trusts our industries, investors are going to trust our industries. We've seen hundreds of billions of dollars poured into electric vehicle manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing. We wish to increase that. We are trying to expand our influence in these sectors and rebuild the middle class through jobs, through costs, and with specific tariffs. Now, our long-term goal is to reduce costs for America. In theory, expanding domestic production will allow us to have vitally important, domestically produced, finished products at our doorstep. That will be monumental to firms, to consumers who want to really see that Made in America tag on their products. Thank you. Gotcha.
Thank you all so much. So now that we kind of have our proposal and you understand exactly what we plan to do, what is that going to do? What is exactly we're going to use with our tariff information or our tariff revenue? And what are we going to actually invest it in? And how is that going to impact our economy?
So the point I'm about to make is very similar to the one I made earlier, and that was because it was easy for us to compromise because we had the very same goal in mind, and that was the problem of the shrinking middle class. So with this tariff revenue, we're only going to have 20% or more tariffs on finished goods. This ensures that the price of essential input goods does not raise, and therefore there's greater price stability. Also, we're going to keep the Make in America Fund with the earmarked revenues for direct payments to manufacturers or vocational training programs, and yeah.
Awesome, but fundamentally, Logan, what is that going to do to our economy?
Yeah, to bring this all home on how we're going to thread the needle with all these different policies to actually improve the American middle class, it's these 4 points here. We're going to see an increase in the workforce. Within the past 2 years, prior to all this trade instability, we saw about 100,000 jobs in electric vehicle and semi-chip conductors created. We're projecting about 150,000 jobs created on the onset of this program. The Bureau of Labor Statistics anticipates an annual compounded increase for the next decade of 3.2% in this industry. So if we can continue to build these stable jobs and communities, we'll see a lot of more FDI in these communities projected out in the future. We're also going to see middle-class income gains, which are also addressed in the next 2 points of supply chain security and price stability. If we have established inputs and we have partnerships set with strategic partners, we know that inputs are going to remain fairly stable. We have more investment, price stability for American producers. We know labor costs here, paired with the protectionist tariffs, we know that production is going to happen domestically. And that's all going to tie back into middle-class income gains. Americans are going to be working in these jobs. We're going to have a stable economy, and that's how we're going to rebuild the middle class. So with that, I think we'll open up to questions.
Does anybody have one? Okay.
Hello again. Thank you for your hard work. You know, the topic that was presented before you was tariff and trade policy, not a shrinking middle class. And so the question arises, since you changed it to the goal being to alleviate a shrinking middle class, that has been with us a long time. How would this group have approached that in 2010, for example, before all this tariff, upheaval has occurred in the last recent events? You don't have to answer. Did the group consider that? Did the group consider pre-tariff mania options for reducing middle class?
It's a great question. Thank you so much for it. So we did consider that, and we understand that now we're in a post-neoliberal era. There was a study by MIT, David Autor in 2013, which highlighted how over 1 million US manufacturing jobs were directly lost because of trade shifting to China. The China shock after they joined the World Trade Organization, that was a direct result of having more free trade without having sufficient retooling, retraining programs for American workers who lost their manufacturing jobs here. So essentially, a lot of our specific industries are targeted, for example, EVs, at trying to bring back some of the car manufacturing to some of the states that have lost them, while at the same time bolstering our national security at a time when China's putting a lot of subsidies towards their EVs. So essentially, we're counterbalancing that while also helping to alleviate the climate crisis. So essentially, we're approaching it through 3 different prongs, and we think that's a quite effective solution.
I can also add on to address the first part of your question about why we ultimately built this topic or built this policy issue into a question about the middle class is because a lot of modern day arguments about tariffs are closely intertwined with building domestic industry and creating jobs for a lot of Americans in areas around the United States that lost their jobs because around the time of these free trade agreements in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, a lot of these manufacturing companies left and moved overseas. So what we're trying to do here is to build an international trade framework to relate back to the issues that we mentioned here with the shrinking middle class.
Yeah, and also along with that, we wanted to center who trade policy is truly for. And on both sides, like during the Biden-Harris administration, they focused on a worker-centric trade policy to support domestic workers. And on the other side, with President Trump, he's really emphasizing bringing back these manufacturing jobs. So we chose the middle class as like the central place to start because both sides are framing their argument around that.
Did the group consider the facts of history that free trade is what developed the strongest middle class in the world, and more free trade led to the lowest prices that this nation and most nations have ever seen, allowing for huge betterment of life, everyday life, and conveniences and luxuries that could never be afforded, and that labor cost is the prime component for increased prices, and the domestic production of those goods will increase. And they said, like the iPhone, triple the cost. That'll be. I was in retail. I sold 1999 shirts out the wazoo for decades, my family business. Back in the 60s, those 1999 shirts may have been $10 or $12, which would equate to $60, $70 today. And that's what they would all be, made in America. Love made in America. But did the group consider the components of, if tariffs is really the answer to increasing the middle class and strengthening, when history shows that it's just the opposite?
It's a really great question. Specifically on iPhones, we also considered that. That's why instead of doing blanket tariffs on all semiconductors, we focus specifically on legacy semiconductors, which are used primarily for defense applications, refrigerators, many of the products that we see today. And in terms of specifically, the free trade question, our industries that we're looking to protect specifically are industries that currently are trading partners are unfairly taking advantage of. They're providing unfair subsidies, and we're simply rebalancing the playing fields. Historically, we haven't had trade partners such as China who are subsidizing their industries, such as in EVs, batteries, and solar, et cetera, to significant level. So essentially, we're just balancing that playing fields. We love free trade, but we can't have free trade in a world where our adversaries or strategic competitors are unfairly exploiting it.
Is it on? Yeah, there we go. Okay. Mine sandwiches a little bit on my colleague Richard's question. To what extent did both teams consider the current reality of the current world economy, especially in terms of the global supply chains and interactions? That's my first question. My second question has to do with, actually ties back to the immigration and the workforce in America today, and the extent to which the workforce is willing to take on these kinds of jobs that seem so fascinating today in terms of restructuring all of business around the world and like turning a light switch on and off.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can address your first one. So I think a huge part of our compromise was compromising on or creating supply chain specific tariffs to build the middle class. So we're talking about no tariffs on the essential raw materials that we will need to to grow these factories and to build domestic industries for EVs and semiconductors, but also in order to build domestic industry in the United States, we're going to have to take a more protectionist route on other sorts of goods, like finished products. And yes, to your concern, that would reorient parts of the global supply chain to where the United States is no longer mainly focused on exporting goods and services, but we're also building. We're taking leadership in these new industries by focusing more on production rather than we've seen in recent years. China has taken leadership in producing these goods. So it will require, if we're looking to build the middle class, it will require shifting priorities within the global supply chain.
Okay, my second question, I'm not sure, and I don't want to dig too much into the policy issue because we're really interested in the way y'all compromised. But I am curious about the fact that, let me put this in context. More than 30 years ago, I was traveling a lot back and forth to Japan and doing business with Japanese companies, building plants in the U.S. And what I discovered then was something I've always remembered when Japanese manufacturers were saying they were really having trouble hiring workers because of the 3 Ds. The 3 Ds were English words, not Japanese words. The 3 Ds were, the problem was the jobs were dirty, dull, and dangerous. That's why I said that this conversation and your work really translates back into the immigration policy. Because if you don't have the workforce willing to do the jobs that you are proposing in your policy that you're going to create, then how do you get there?
Yeah, so part of our policy is we're going to earmark. So not only are we going to set an international framework, but what certain politicians haven't done right now that are in support of tariff policies is they're not moving past that, and they're not setting up a plan for what we're actually going to do to build domestic industry. So what we've proposed here is not only an international trade framework, but a domestic plan to at least get the infrastructure for domestic industry to get going in these industries. So we're talking about earmarking the tariff revenue for a specific purpose, which is to invest in domestic industry and encourage and incentivize foreign companies to move their EV plants or their factories over to the U.S.
And building on Johnny's point, so there's many workers, for example, in Detroit, previously worked in car manufacturing and are unhappy about the fact that the car manufacturing shifted abroad, and therefore we're essentially, a lot of these subsidies from the Made in America Fund are to specifically encourage companies to invest, to build new EV factories, new clean car factories within some of these areas that were historically hit very hard by some of the free trade policies that have been enacted in the past.
I think part of it too, why we focus on the tech sector, is recognizing that the manufacturing industry is somewhat on the decline. So how can we transition to a more modern age of manufacturing? We are targeting electric vehicles, but it's a whole different manufacturing process than it was 30 years ago. There's a lot of automation involved now. So pairing up our vocational training along with recognizing that automation is along the way and transitioning us into a new age of what does it actually mean to be manufacturing in America, I think strikes a good balance there.
Yeah, and also going off of that, I think that if the jobs are good paying and there are incentives for workers to return to these manufacturing jobs that are really essential to build the future of our economy, I think that American citizens and immigrants too, but I think that a lot of these displaced workers will go and be happy to work in these new manufacturing plants.
I know we're running short on time, but quick question. Did your compromise consider the tit for tat, the back and forth, if the U.S. Congress implemented your plan and there was pushback? Or is this going to be just a top-down U.S. Policy shift, and we'll see what happens?
It's a great question. Thank you so much for it. And we did consider, potential tit for tat. That's why the tariffs that we propose are specifically in industries where there is unfair subsidies from foreign countries. So essentially, we're just leveling the playing field. Where, if someone takes advantage of you, you don't just let them, run all over you. We are simply ensuring that we're, putting boundaries and ensuring that we can sufficiently protect our own industries against unfair foreign trade practices.
Yeah, and of course, by reforming the IEEPA, we're talking about a 60-day sunset period for members of Congress to, a part of that process, a part of that sunset period that we hope would be is that members of Congress go and talk with their constituents about the impacts of these tariff policies. What would, if foreign countries try to retaliate with retaliatory tariffs on American exporters, how will American exporters in certain constituencies, how will they be affected? So by recognizing the benefits of a federal system and diverse perspectives, we're allowing everyone at the table to talk about their experiences and how they will be impacted economically by certain tariff policies.
So you see the 60-day sunset is a key element.
Oh yeah, it's key because we're really trying to establish certainty in American investment. Key to this project would be foreign companies feel confident in stable policies. They have confidence in the American system to make this drastic decision, which would be to reorient the global supply chain and move their manufacturing to the U.S. So we need to impose congressional mechanisms to ensure that investors feel confident in this major decision that they're partaking in.
One final, the group was a group aware and consider that America has a historically low unemployment rate. It's around 4%.
Sorry, Ethan did a lot of research on that. But no, we understand the impacts of unemployment rate, but part of that is what's the distribution of workers, and especially we want to target certain communities where historically there's lack of education, and that goes back to the Made in America Fund of providing vocational training and providing educational opportunities. So whether it's implemented and the distribution of it is targeted towards communities where there's a lack of workers in a certain industry, it gives us the flexibility to create manufacturing in areas that might be struggling and tailor that response there.
Yeah, and I'd also like to bring up the point that while that's a fair point, when we're thinking about growing the middle class, we're trying to improve wages. That may not necessarily be directed to the employment rate specifically, but we're trying to raise wages and we're trying to lower essential costs. And we feel that our policy will do this.
Yeah, and something else that we've also discussed is the fact that with the Trump administration threatening to place tariffs on semiconductors, for example, TSMC, the biggest semiconductor company in the world, the most advanced semiconductor company in the world, invested the largest foreign direct investment in the US, total of $160 billion in multiple plants in Arizona. And each job that's created by one TSMC worker, which we also discussed, they often bring in immigrants from Taiwan to do that, creates 1.1 jobs for the supply chain for semiconductors and 2 additional jobs for the local community. So that's exponential job growth there. And since Phoenix is experiencing significant migration, is one of the highest population growing cities in the world, we are taking that into account. So there'll be a lot more job demands, especially in those high growth areas.
I was hoping that I would be the last question at the last presentation because that allows me to give something of a benediction rather than talking about tariffs. Richard will know that this is the price you pay for getting Brad Kelgel on the panel. But it hasn't been that many years ago, or at least it didn't seem like it was that many years ago, when I was standing in the same shoes that you are right now. As a matter of fact, I suspect the same is true for all 4 of us on this panel. We were coming to the end of our formal education, and we were absolutely energized by the opportunity to study these kind of questions you all are looking at here. We saw this as a life's calling. I would like to think that we were just as intelligent, just as articulate, just as enthusiastic and self-confident as you guys are. I probably wasn't. Maybe they were. I definitely wasn't. But that enthusiasm sustained me for a long time, and I'm here to wish that it will sustain you. I can look back over the arc of my life and tell you that the time and effort I have devoted to these sort of questions has been one of the most meaningful things I have ever done. It will be for you. And if I were called upon to speak on behalf of my generation to a collection of talented people like you, I would say that we need you. We need you more than ever. My generation, actually, I take some pride in some of the problems that we took on and solved. We made our share of progress. But we have not left you with all that great of a world, frankly, and the problems that are confronting your group will be at least as big or bigger than they were for my group. I guess my bottom line message is you guys are on the right track, and I encourage you to stay on it. And if you are inclined to do so on a career basis, I would mention to you that there's a school around here called the Martin School of Public Policy. I wouldn't want you to forget that. It's one of the leading schools of public policy in America and always has been, as a matter of fact. And that by virtue of this distinguished faculty of which my friend Merle Hackbart is an appropriate representative. And I hope you'll think about that when you think about what you're going to do with all this accumulated talent that each of you has exhibited here today. I would want you to know that all 4 of us are on your side. We don't just say this, we mean it. Each of us has given time back to the Martin School and to various other projects in public policy in an effort to pursue the same objectives you have, and that is to make the world a better place. So I thank you for you have honored us by your presence. But you're going to find that the time you devoted to this will be good for you as well. Provide a lot of satisfaction. Thank you for being here.
hadn't checked their alarms, so we had to send out a search team to find out where they were, and they were where we expected them to be, in their bed. So don't be found in your bed at 9 o'clock because the bus will be leaving quite soon after that. But I think I hope you enjoyed the program here at Lexington, Kentucky, and the university. Saw a little bit of the bluegrass and had a chance to get a feel for this community. And Brad, thank you for your commercial, and I appreciate that.
One quick thing, Earl, if I could. From the students, how about a round of applause for the judges? And then secondly, for all your mentors, the people who work with you. And for our video crew, who there were people on board not streaming live.
And I will make one comment, and I've witnessed several of these presentations, and I really truly do believe this was the most outstanding group of presentations. Oh,
I do, but you know he's handled it extremely well. I haven't seen him in a couple of years now.
Okay. Bye. Have fun in DC. We will, thank you. Is that next week? Starting tomorrow, yeah.
Hopefully we get good weather.
I hope so.
Thank you guys so much for
You're
listening to our
welcome.
presentation.
You're welcome, Olivia. Have fun in DC.
I forgot how my name tag. I was like, how do you know my name?